Book 3, The February Trials, Keller Case Flies. Written by R.B. Martin. The Delta 88 rolled through red lights in the cold night air, keeping pace with the convoy of black SUVs ahead of us. Ajax had something smooth bumping through the radio, more his style than mine, but I didn't mind it. The bass thumped in rhythm with the headache I was still nursing. It even managed to pull a small smile out of me. Funny thing about trials. Sometimes they start long before anyone ever sees a courtroom. The scent of his black and mild filled the cabin. We rolled into central booking at the corner of downtown Main and Justice Way. The convoy slowed and lined up along the curb. 4 SUVs, 4 doors opening at the same time, like somebody had rehearsed it. Agents in blackout tactical gear stepped out in formation. No talking, no hesitation. They pulled Rupert Hawthorne, Frankie Scar Marconi, and Scar's new partner, Joey Walsh, from the vehicles and walked them straight into processing. No ceremony, no last words. Just the sound of boots on concrete and metal doors swallowing them whole. Ajax and I slid out of the Delta 88 as Connie Mackland stepped from one of the SUVs beside a younger woman I recognized immediately. Laura Vance, first time I'd seen her face to face. Up close, she looked smaller than the storm she'd been carrying. I already knew what kind of night it was going to be. Paperwork, hours of it. Connie Mackland and I finally stepped out the front doors of the building sometime after midnight. The street had gone quiet, just a few yellow streetlights buzzing overhead while we waited for a taxi. She broke the silence first. "I hear your office took some damage," she said. "You got somewhere to stay while repairs get sorted out?" I rubbed the back of my neck. Haven't gotten that far in my head yet, to be honest. She studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the street. "You can stay at my place tonight. Guest room's open." I gave a tired half laugh. "Yeah, that would be great." We spent a few hours sitting in the front room of her house, talking back and forth across the couch cushions. The night had slowed down enough for conversation to feel normal again. At some point, she drifted off mid-sentence. I took that as my cue. I slipped into the guest room and turned on the shower, cranking the water hot enough that you dance around a little before you let it touch your skin. Steam filled the room. I had just stepped under the water when I noticed it. A silhouette. Curved. Faint behind the fogged glass. That's when it hit me. The rest of January had already put me on trial, and February was going to be something else entirely. She might just end up being my judge, my jury, and maybe even my executioner. Chapter 1. Sinclair. January 25th, 2026. I'd already worn out my welcome once in this city. Didn't need to make a habit of it. Ajax and the feds still hadn't returned my Skylark, which meant I'd been riding my bike through the middle of January like some kind of idiot who enjoyed frostbite. Cold air has a way of reminding you you're still alive, or still stupid. Sometimes, both. Connie Mackland had been letting me use her guest room for 2 weeks now. Housekeeping only had to make 1 bed every morning, though. I'd been spending most of my free time over at Frank's Hardware, learning the fine art of drywall spackling and minor home repairs. Turns out, when you punch holes in walls and doors during a homicide investigation, somebody eventually expects them to get fixed. Somewhere between keeping my PEI license up to date and maintaining a $225 a month smoking habit, I'd let my renter's insurance lapse about 2 years ago. Never bothered to renew it. Didn't seem important at the time. But when I heard old man Murphy downstairs saying his insurance wouldn't cover the damage in Unit 3B, which just happened to be my office, I told him not to worry. I'd have my insurance cover it. Sometimes, a lie is just a down payment on a problem you'll deal with later. Besides, I needed an excuse to get the place repaired. And if I was being honest with myself, I needed to get out of Connie's house before things started getting too serious between us. I was standing inside Frank's Hardware picking up supplies for the office when an older woman approached me. Gray coat, tired eyes, hands that looked like they'd spent a lifetime holding things together. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "You the private investigator?" I nodded. "Depends who's asking." She hesitated. "My husband," she said quietly. "He's missing." I looked at the list of drywall supplies in my hand, then back at her. "February just offered me a missing persons case. Well, if you'd like to meet me back at my office, we can talk in private," I told her. "I just need to finish grabbing a few things. I'll see you there." She nodded. I paid Frank with an IOU and tied a couple gallons of paint to the back of my Indian. I hate to admit it, but I'd missed riding her, even if it was 14 degrees out. Cold air has a way of waking a man up. I raced back across town and made it to the office just in time to greet Mrs. Margaret Sinclair at the front doors. We climbed the stairs together and stepped through the frosted glass door that read, "Marty Martin, Private Investigator, LLC." The gold lettering had started to fade. The office itself was still mid-construction. Fresh drywall patches spotted the walls. A few bullet holes remained where I hadn't gotten around to fixing them yet, and the fire escape window was still boarded up from the night everything went sideways. Mrs. Sinclair took it all in without saying a word. I hung my coat over the back of the chair and motioned for her to sit. "All right, Mrs. Sinclair," I said. "Let's start from the beginning." I opened the notebook and clicked my pen. Mrs. Sinclair shifted slightly in the chair, looking past me for a moment at the patched walls and the boarded window before she started talking. "Alfred keeps a routine," she said. "Doctors told us that helps slow the confusion. Every day he eats lunch around noon, then he takes a walk through the neighborhood, just around the block, sometimes two." I wrote it down. Routine, walks, afternoon. "He's done that walk for years," she continued, "even after the diagnosis." "What time did he leave yesterday?" "About 12:30, maybe closer to 1. "And when did you realize something was wrong?" "By 3, I started to worry," she said. "By 5, I knew something wasn't right." I nodded. "Did you call the police?" "Yes. They said sometimes people with Alzheimer's wander and turn up a few hours later." "They're not wrong," I said. "But he didn't come home," she replied. "No." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photograph, the kind you get printed at a drugstore kiosk. She slid it across the desk. The man in the picture looked about 70. White hair, wire frame glasses, the kind of smile you see on someone who spent most of his life fixing things for other people. "Alfred Sinclair," she said softly. I studied the photo for a second, then set it beside my notebook. "Did he take anything with him?" I asked. "Phone? Wallet?" "He had his wallet. No phone. Alfred never liked carrying one." "What about his car?" "He doesn't drive anymore." "Any place he liked to go?" I asked. "Anywhere outside the walking route?" She shook her head. "Just the neighborhood park sometimes." I wrote that down. Then I looked back up at her. "Mrs. Sinclair, I'm going to ask a question I ask everyone." She waited. "Did your husband have any reason not to come home?" She frowned. "No." "No financial problems, arguments, people he owed money to?" She shook her head again. "Nothing like that." The February wind pushed against the boarded window behind me. I closed the notebook. "All right," I said. "I'll start by checking the neighborhood. Parks, walking paths, bus stops. Anywhere a man might wander if he forgot where he was headed." Mrs. Sinclair nodded, relief creeping into her face, like someone had finally turned a light on in a dark room. "Thank you, Mr. Martin." I stood and pulled my coat off the rack. "Call me Marty," I said. I tucked Alfred Sinclair's photograph into my pocket. Outside, the wind had teeth. February was just getting started. Chapter 2. Sinclair. A January 25th, 2026. On the ride over to Ashwood Public Park, Ajax decided it was a good time to call. The wind cut through my coat like it had something personal against me. 14 degrees and dropping, and the Indian didn't exactly come with a heated seat. The engine rattled steady beneath me as the neighborhood started thinning out past Riverbend. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled over near a row of bare oak trees and fished it out. Ajax. Of course it was. I flipped it open. "What?" I said. "That how you answer all your calls now?" Ajax's voice came through the line, half amused, half tired. "Only the ones that interrupt a man riding a motorcycle in the middle of winter." He chuckled. "Still don't have the Skylark back?" "Not unless the feds decided to drop it off while I was buying drywall." "Yeah, about that," Ajax said. There was a pause, the kind of pause that usually meant the next part of the conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. I leaned against the bike and watched a thin layer of frost creep along the edge of the road. "What's going on?" I asked. "You remember Rupert Hawthorne?" I let out a slow breath. "Hard man to forget." "Well," Ajax said, "you might want to start remembering him a little more carefully." That pause again. The cold suddenly felt a little sharper. "You're kidding." "Nope." "For murder?" I asked. "Money talks, Marty." I rubbed my temple. "What about Marconi?" "Still sitting tight," Ajax said. "Scar doesn't have Hawthorne's kind of lawyers." That figured. And Walsh? "Federal hold." I looked out toward the dark tree line near the park entrance ahead. "So why are you calling me?" I asked. Ajax exhaled into the phone. "Because if Hawthorne walks, the first thing he's going to do is start cleaning up loose ends." The wind pushed across the empty road. "And you," Ajax added quietly, "are sitting right at the top of that list." I let the wind blow across the road for a moment before answering. "I'm working a case right now," I said. "I don't have time for this." Ajax didn't respond right away. He had that way of letting silence sit on the line until it got uncomfortable. "Marty," he finally said, "you might want to make time." "I've got a missing person," I replied. "Old man with Alzheimer's. Walked out of his neighborhood yesterday and never came back." "Police involved?" "Yeah." "And?" Ajax sighed. "That means they'll look for about a day before they start calling hospitals and morgues." "Yeah," I said. "That's usually how it goes." Another pause. Then Ajax cleared his throat. "Listen, Hawthorne's people are already moving. Lawyers, private security, the kind of money that doesn't like losing." "I'm aware of the kind," I said. "If he makes bail, things are going to get messy." "They already are." I hung up before he could say anything else. The wind snapped through the empty street again. I slid the phone back into my coat pocket and swung my leg over the Indian. The engine coughed once before settling into a low growl. Somewhere across town, Rupert Hawthorne was sitting in a holding cell, waiting for lawyers to start turning gears. But right now, I had a different problem. I rolled into the gravel entrance of Ashwood Public Park. The place was empty. Winter had stripped the trees bare, and the walking trail cut through the park like a thin gray scar through the frost-covered grass. If Alfred Sinclair had gotten lost anywhere, it would have been here. I killed the engine and stepped off the bike. The cold hit harder without the motor running. I pulled the photograph from my pocket and looked at the old man's smiling face again. "All right, Mr. Sinclair," I muttered. "Let's see where you wandered off to." Based on the time Mrs. Sinclair said he usually went for his walks, I figured by now he could have strayed 15, maybe 20 miles on foot if he'd kept moving. Alzheimer's had a way of turning a simple walk into a long road. This was going to be a day. I'd already been combing through Ashwood Public Park for a couple of hours. The walking trails wound through bare trees and empty picnic grounds, the winter grass crunching under my boots with every step. Every so often I'd stop and listen. Nothing. Just wind pushing through the branches and the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond Riverbend. Then the sky started to change. A cold January storm rolled in from the east, fast and mean. The clouds moved low and heavy, swallowing the pale afternoon light. A few minutes later, the rain started. Big drops. Within seconds, my coat was soaked through. I pulled the collar up and kept walking. If Alfred Sinclair had wandered out here yesterday, the rain wasn't going to make it any easier to find him. If anything, it meant the clock had been running longer than I liked. The trail curved around a small pond near the center of the park. The water was dark and still, broken only by the rain tapping against the surface. I slowed down and scanned the tree line. Something about the ground near the edge of the trail caught my eye. Footprints. Not many. Just enough to break the smooth layer of frost and mud. I crouched down, brushing some wet leaves aside. The prints were shallow and uneven, and heading off the trail into the trees. I stood there for a moment, watching the rain fall harder. "All right, Mr. Sinclair," I muttered. Based on the time Mrs. Sinclair said he usually went for his walks, I figured by now he could have strayed 15, maybe 20 miles on foot if he'd kept moving. Alzheimer's had a way of turning a simple walk into a long road. This was going to be a day. I'd already been combing through Ashwood Public Park for a couple of hours. The walking trails wound through bare trees and empty picnic grounds, the winter grass crunching under my boots with every step. Every so often I'd stop and listen. Nothing. Just wind pushing through the branches and the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond Riverbend. Then the sky started to change. A cold January storm rolled in from the east, fast and mean. The clouds moved low and heavy, swallowing the pale afternoon light. A few minutes later, the rain started. Big drops, the kind that sting when they hit your face. Within seconds, my coat was soaked through. I pulled the collar up and kept walking. If Alfred Sinclair had wandered out here yesterday, the rain wasn't going to make it any easier to find him. If anything, it meant the clock had been running longer than I liked. The trail curved around a small pond near the center of the park. The water was dark and still, broken only by the rain tapping against the surface. I slowed down and scanned the tree line. Something about the ground near the edge of the trail caught my eye. Footprints. Not many. Just enough to break the smooth layer of frost and mud. I crouched down, brushing some wet leaves aside. The prints were shallow and uneven. Older tread, and heading off the trail. Into the trees. I stood there for a moment, watching the rain fall harder. "All right, Mr. Sinclair," I muttered. "Let's see where you went." I spent another 2 hours searching the park near the lake. By then, the storm had settled into a steady, miserable rain. The kind that seeps through seams and collars and makes every step feel heavier than the last. The trails had emptied out hours ago. Just me. And the wind coming off the water. I was circling the far side of the lake when I noticed it. A shape out near a small bank of sand where the shoreline curved inward. At first it looked like nothing more than a pile of dark brush washed up from the edge of the water. Then it moved. Or maybe the rain shifted across it. Either way, my stomach tightened. It had been below freezing all night. A man Alfred Sinclair's age wouldn't last long out here. I didn't walk. I ran. Mud kicked up behind my boots as I cut across the wet grass toward the shoreline. The shape grew clearer with every step. A body. Curled slightly on its side, half covered in damp leaves. My breath came hard as I dropped to one knee beside him and turned him gently onto his back. His skin was pale. Cold. I pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, searching for a pulse. There it was. Faint, weak, but there. Alive. Barely. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Well, Mr. Sinclair," I muttered, His eyelids fluttered slightly but didn't open. I pulled my phone from my coat and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? This is Marty Martin, I said, already shrugging off my coat and covering the old man with it. I've got an elderly male suffering from exposure at Ashwood Public Park near the East Lake Bank. I looked down at the old man again. Still breathing, I added, but not by much. I shrugged out of my pea coat and wrapped it around him. It still held my body heat. I tucked it tight around his shoulders and chest, pulling the collar up to block the wind coming off the lake. His skin felt like ice under my hands, the kind of cold that seeps into a man when the night gets too long. Stay with me, Alfred, I muttered. His breathing was shallow, uneven, but it was there. The rain kept falling, tapping against the water behind us and soaking through the grass around my knees. I kept one hand on the side of his neck, feeling that weak pulse thudding under the skin. Slow, but stubborn. Sirens started in the distance, faint at first, then louder. I leaned back slightly and looked out across the lake, rain streaking the surface like 1,000 tiny needles. Yeah, I said quietly, you're gonna make it. It felt good to have a case finally lean in the right direction for once, but we weren't out of the woods yet. It took the EMTs about 20 minutes to reach my location after I made the call. 20 minutes out in that weather felt a lot longer than it sounds on paper. By then, I'd pulled Mr. Sinclair into a half-hug, keeping him against my chest, so whatever body heat I had left could transfer through the coat wrapped around him. His breathing was still there. Weak, but steady enough to keep me from thinking about the alternative. Without the pea coat, though, the cold had started working on me too. My hands had gone numb first, then my legs. The kind of cold that creeps in slow and quiet, like it's trying not to be noticed until it's too late. I kept talking to him anyway. Didn't matter if he could hear me. Your wife's waiting for you, Alfred, I said quietly, so you don't get to check out here. Somewhere through the rain, I finally heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Then voices, boots running across wet ground. Over here, someone shouted. 2 EMTs came jogging down the slope from the trail, carrying a stretcher between them. Their jackets were already soaked through from the storm. One of them knelt beside us. How long's he been exposed? Found him about 20 minutes ago, I said, but his wife said he'd been missing since yesterday. My voice a little rougher than I expected. They checked his pulse, shined a light into his eyes. All right, the EMT said. Let's get him warmed up. As they secured the straps, one of them looked over at me. You all right? I tried to stand. My legs disagreed. The world tilted slightly to the left. Yeah, I said, forcing a breath out. Just cold. The EMT gave me a look that said he'd heard that one before. Sit down, he said, before you fall down. I sat. For the first time all day, the tension in my shoulders started to loosen. Across the stretcher, Alfred Sinclair was still breathing. And for today. That was enough. I reached into the inner lining of my pea coat and pulled out my pack of Luckies. The cardboard was soft. Damp. I opened it anyway and tapped one out. Bent. Useless. Just my luck, I muttered. I slipped the pack back into my coat and let out a slow breath. Maybe that was as good a sign as any to quit. Save myself $200 a month. Maybe even put that money toward getting my renter's insurance back up and running again. Stranger things had happened. Chapter 3. Sinclair. A. January 25th, 2026. Just as I pulled my gloves tight, the phone buzzed in my pocket. Ajax. Again, I flipped it open. What? Ajax didn't bother with small talk this time. Hawthorne made bail. The wind cut across the empty park road while that settled in. You're kidding. Nope, Ajax said. Money moved fast. Figures. He's out of county by now, Ajax continued. Private security, 3 lawyers, and a convoy that makes the Secret Service look underfunded. I leaned forward against the handlebars, staring out at the empty lake. That was quick. Ajax let out a slow breath on the other end. Marty. Yeah, you might want to start watching your back. I glanced down at the damp pack of Luckies still in my coat pocket. Yeah, I said quietly. Seems like everybody's having a good February except me. The ride back into the city felt colder than the ride out. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the news Ajax had just dropped on me. Or maybe it was the simple fact that Rupert Hawthorne was no longer sitting behind a locked door. The Indian's engine rattled steady beneath me as the lights of downtown started bleeding through the gray February evening. Traffic was picking up again, people leaving work, headlights reflecting off wet pavement like streaks of white paint. Normal life. Funny thing about normal life, it keeps moving even when somebody dangerous just got set loose. I cut down Main Street and rolled past the courthouse. 2 news vans were already parked outside. Didn't take long for that story to spread. Hawthorne making bail was going to sell a lot of papers tomorrow morning, and probably scare a few people who knew exactly what kind of man he was. My phone buzzed again in my coat pocket. Different number this time. I pulled over near the curb and answered. Marty Martin. A familiar voice came through the line. Laura Vance. Mr. Martin, she said quietly. You heard. Yeah, I said. He's out. There was a pause on the other end. I don't think I'm safe, she said. Rain dripped from the brim of my helmet onto the sidewalk. Where are you? I asked. At home. Stay there, I said. I'll be there in 10 minutes. By the time I got to Laura Vance's apartment, the blacked-out Delta 88 was already parked at the curb. The entire building roped off in yellow tape. Blue and red lights stretched down the block. That was the first bad sign. The second was the crowd. People were pouring out of the building like someone had just pulled a fire alarm. Tenants in coats, slippers, bathrobes, some of them still holding phones or half-finished conversations. 2 uniformed officers were guiding them down the sidewalk in a hurry. Keep moving, folks, one of them said. Just step across the street. I killed the Indian's engine and stepped off the bike. Ajax was standing near the front of the Delta 88, collar up against the rain, watching the evacuation like a man who already knew how the story ended. I walked over. What happened? I asked. Ajax didn't look at me right away. Bomb threat. That word hung in the air between us. My stomach tightened. Laura! He finally turned toward me. Still inside. When I got off the phone with her, I got here as quick as I could. The rain picked up again, bouncing off the pavement and running down the windshield of the Delta. Talk to me, I said. Ajax nodded toward the building. Call came in about 10 minutes ago, he said. Anonymous voice. Said there was an explosive device somewhere inside the complex. And you believe it? Ajax gave a dry half-smile. With Hawthorne out on bail? He shrugged. Yeah, I believe it. I looked up at the apartment building. 3 floors. Old brick, dozens of windows. Some still lit. Some dark. And Laura? I asked again. Ajax's expression tightened just enough for me to notice. She's not answering her phone. The wind pushed rain down the empty sidewalk. I stared at the front door of the building, then back at Ajax. How long before the bomb squad gets here? 10 minutes. I nodded once. Good. Ajax squinted at me. Why? I started walking toward the entrance. Because, I said. I only need 5. Marty, no, you can't go in there. I moved faster than he could respond. I took the stairs 2 at a time. The stairwell smelled like old paint and wet concrete. My boots echoed off the walls as I pushed up to the 3rd floor, heart pounding harder with every step. Laura's door was halfway down the hall. Apartment 3C. The hallway was empty. Too empty. I moved fast, closing the distance in seconds. I grabbed the knob and twisted. Click. That's when I knew. Too late. The blast hit before my brain could finish the thought. A sharp crack, loud enough to split the air, and the door exploded inward. The reinforced steel frame absorbed most of the charge, but it didn't stop the momentum. The force of it slammed the door and me together like we'd been hit by a moving car. 1 second, I was standing in the hallway. The next, I was airborne. The door carried me across the room and straight through the drywall of the adjoining apartment. Plaster and insulation burst around me as we tore through the wall like paper. For a split second, I saw the kitchen of the neighboring unit. A stove, a hanging light, a table with 2 coffee cups still sitting on it. Then the world tilted sideways. My back hit the floor. My head followed. Sound drained out of the room until all that remained was a high ringing somewhere deep inside my skull. The last thing I remember seeing was the broken door lying half on top of me, smoke drifting through the air like gray fog. Then everything went black. Ajax leaned down closer so I could hear him over the ringing. "Good thing you were wearing that bike helmet," he said. His voice sounded like it was coming through a tunnel. I've seen guys back in Afghanistan who wouldn't have taken that blast. I blinked a few times, trying to clear the smoke and dust out of my eyes. My head felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. "Lucky me," I muttered. Ajax helped me sit up slowly. The room steadied just enough for the world to stop spinning. Then he said it. "There's a body in Laura Vance's apartment." The words landed harder than the blast. "Well," he added grimly, "what's left of one?" My stomach tightened. I pushed myself up onto one elbow and looked through the jagged hole where the wall used to be. Across the broken doorway into Laura's place, the apartment was a mess of smoke, splintered wood, and scattered debris. Bomb squad techs were already moving around carefully inside. One of them was kneeling near the center of the living room. A black tarp lay on the floor. Too small. Too still. "Laura?" I asked. Ajax shook his head slowly. "Hard to tell yet," he said. "Blast did most of the damage." The ringing in my ears hadn't stopped, but something colder settled in my chest. If Hawthorne had gotten to her before we did, then February had just turned into something a lot worse than a trial. By the time the smoke finally cleared and Ajax helped drag me out of the rubble, the street outside the building had turned into a circus. Local patrol cars, fire engines, ambulances, yellow tape going up across the sidewalk. Neighbors stood across the street watching like it was a parade nobody wanted to miss. Ajax had one arm under my shoulder as we stepped out of the building entrance. My legs still weren't fully cooperating, and the ringing in my ears hadn't completely let go. That's when I saw Dennis Halpern standing at the foot of the steps. Detective Dennis Halpern. First came the look of a friend. Second came the look of a cop. He stepped forward. "Ajax," he said, nodding toward me. "How is he?" Ajax kept his grip on my arm. "He's banged up," Ajax replied. "Needs medical attention." Dennis looked me over for a moment. His eyes lingered on the dust-covered coat, the helmet still strapped under my chin, the blood trickling down the side of my face. Then the expression changed. Professional. Cold. "All right," he said quietly. He reached down and pulled a pair of cuffs from his belt. "Sorry, Marty." I blinked at him. "For what?" Dennis stepped closer. "Martin Keller," he said. "You are under arrest." The words hung in the cold air like a second explosion. I glanced at Ajax. "Ajax, what for?" Dennis answered before Ajax could. "Violation of conduct unbecoming of a licensed investigator," he said. "Reckless endangerment." and interference with an active federal investigation. The cuffs clicked around my wrists before I had time to argue, metal against bone. Cold. I looked down at my watch. The glass was cracked. The hands had stopped moving. 12:47 p.m. Ajax looked at me. "Keep your mouth shut," and walked away. Dennis sat there a moment, letting the EMTs finish wrapping the bandage around my shoulder before he spoke again. "I opened the envelope," he said. I watched him through the dull haze in my head. "What was in it?" Dennis exhaled slowly. "A series of photographs." "Of what?" "Of you." That got my attention. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded stack of glossy prints. He held them up just long enough for me to see. Me walking into Connie Macklin's house. Me leaving the next morning. Me getting on the Indian. Different angles. Different days. 3 weeks' worth, Dennis said. The EMT paused for a second, glancing between the two of us before going back to work. Dennis lowered the photos. "You didn't tell me you've been living with Connie." I didn't answer. Didn't need to. Dennis already had the proof sitting in his hand. "You know what that means, Marty." His voice wasn't angry. It was worse, disappointed. "This is a clear violation tied to your investigation. Connie Macklin is connected to the Hawthorne case. Every piece of evidence you've submitted is now considered compromised." He tapped the photos lightly. "In a courtroom, this looks like bias." I stared at the cracked ceiling of the ambulance. Dennis wasn't finished. "There was something else in the envelope." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small evidence bag. Inside it was a USB drive. Black, cheap, common, but suddenly the most expensive piece of plastic in the city. "There was also a recording," Dennis continued. "A conversation between you and Federal Agent Jackson." My stomach tightened. Dennis leaned closer. "You remember that conversation?" I nodded slowly. Dennis gave a small shake of his head. "You're aware he let you incriminate yourself, right?" "What are you talking about?" Dennis held the evidence bag up. "He waited," Dennis said quietly. "He waited until you said the word USB first." The ambulance siren finally kicked on as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Dennis's voice cut through the rising noise. "After that," he said, "all he had to do was keep you talking." Even though I was in the back of an ambulance, I kept my mouth shut about confirming or denying anything Dennis had just laid out. Dennis knew why. He was doing his job, and I wasn't about to help him hang me out to dry. Not tonight. Not after everything that had just happened. He watched me for a moment like he expected something. An argument. A denial. Maybe even a confession if the concussion had scrambled my better judgment. I gave him nothing. The EMT finished tightening the bandage around my shoulder and glanced across the small ambulance cabin. "Detective," he said. Dennis looked over. "He's going to have to go to the hospital for a full workup, probably overnight observation." Dennis leaned back against the bench seat, thinking it over. Outside, the siren cut through the wet streets, while the ambulance bounced over another pothole. "He's under arrest," Dennis said finally. The EMT nodded. "Then he's under arrest at the hospital." Dennis looked back at me. "You hear that, Marty?" I gave a slow nod. "Yeah." He studied my face a moment longer before continuing. "You're lucky you're alive." "Been hearing that a lot tonight." Dennis didn't smile. The ambulance slowed as the flashing lights of Riverbend Memorial came into view through the rear windows. Rain streaked the glass, while the vehicle rolled into the emergency entrance. Dennis stood as the EMTs began opening the back doors. "Get him patched up," he told them, "but don't let him out of your sight." The cold night air rushed into the ambulance as they pulled the stretcher out. I caught one last look at Dennis, standing there under the red emergency lights. For a second, he didn't look like a detective. He looked like a man trying to decide if the friend he'd known for years had just become the suspect he'd been hunting. Then the doors swung shut between us. Chapter 4. Sinclair, January 25th, 2026. The ambulance doors burst open under the harsh white glow of the emergency bay. 2 EMTs rolled the stretcher out fast, wheels rattling over the concrete. They were met halfway by a charge nurse and a woman in dark blue scrubs, moving with the kind of calm that only comes from seeing chaos every day. Dr. Megan Davis, 32. Fire-red hair tied back in a loose knot that looked like it had fought with gravity and lost sometime around hour 12 of her shift. Thin-frame glasses rested low on her nose as she stepped alongside the stretcher, already scanning the situation. Her voice was steady, professional. "What kind of trauma?" One of the EMTs answered while they pushed the stretcher through the sliding ER doors. "Possible blast exposure. Door charge. Patient was behind the entry point when the device detonated." Dr. Davis nodded once, already moving beside me. "Vitals? Pulse 110, irregular. Blood pressure 140/90. Oxygen 95% on room air. Possible concussion, left shoulder trauma, and he's got some ringing in the ears." Dr. Davis leaned down into my field of vision, with grief in her face. She then stripped off her gloves and tossed them into the stainless bin beside the bed. She gave the monitor one last look before turning toward the doorway, where Dennis was leaning against the frame. She shook her head slightly. "Martin Keller," she said, almost to herself. "You really can't stay out of my trauma bay, can you?" Dennis looked between the two of us. "You two know each other?" Dr. Davis pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "Riverbend's not that big, Detective. People who work nights tend to cross paths." She nodded toward me. "Usually when he's bleeding." I shifted slightly on the bed. "Nice to see you too, Doc." She ignored that and flipped through the chart. "We're keeping him overnight." Dennis frowned. "That necessary?" Dr. Davis gave him a look that suggested she'd been asked that question 1,000 times before. "He was behind a blast door when a charge went off," she said evenly. "Possible concussion, internal bruising, and his ears are still ringing." She tapped the monitor beside me. "I'd like to keep an eye on his neurological response." Dennis crossed his arms. "He's under arrest." Dr. Davis shrugged. "Then he's under arrest in a hospital bed." She scribbled a note across the chart and handed it off to the charge nurse passing by. "If you want to station an officer here, that's fine," she continued. "Otherwise, hospital security can watch him." Dennis glanced down the hallway where 2 security guards were already posted near the nurse's station. "Security's fine." He stepped closer to the bed, looking down at me. "You're not going anywhere tonight anyway." I looked back at him. Wasn't planning on it. Dennis studied me for a moment like he was still trying to figure out which side of the line I'd landed on. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow we'll talk about that USB drive." Then he turned and walked out of the room. Dr. Davis watched him disappear down the hallway before turning back toward me. She folded her arms. "You mind telling me what kind of explosion puts you through drywall this time?" I stared up at the ceiling lights. "Door charge." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Of course it was." "Nice to know my reputation's holding." She pulled a stool over and sat beside the bed. "Martin," she said quietly, switching out of doctor mode for a moment. "Most people who come in here after a blast like that don't walk in talking." "Guess I'm hard to get rid of." She gave a small smirk. "Riverbend's been trying for years." Then she picked up the pen light again and leaned closer. "All right, Detective," she said. "Let's see if that thick skull of yours still works." She held up 3 fingers. "How many?" 3. She lowered one. "And now?" 2. She paused. "Who's the current president?" I frowned slightly. That a medical question or a political one? This time she actually laughed. Yeah, she said, standing back up. You'll live. I spent most of the night cuffed to the side rail of the hospital bed. Turns out a blast concussion and an arrest warrant make for a pretty lousy combination of sleep. Every couple of hours, the ER doors would burst open with another patient, and Megan would disappear into the hallway again. Broken arm, car accident. One poor guy who thought a nail gun was safer than a hammer. Riverbend never really sleeps. Between cases, she'd drift back into the room, check the monitors, shine the pen light in my eyes, ask the same questions over and over, like she was trying to make sure the man answering them was still the same one she admitted. Sometime near the end of the night, the chaos finally slowed down. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed quietly, while the first gray light of morning started creeping through the windows near the ceiling. Megan stepped back into the room holding a clipboard. Her hair had mostly escaped the knot she'd tied it into earlier, and the look in her eyes said she'd been awake for about 20 hours too many. She checked the chart once more and then looked down at me. "All right, Marty," she said quietly. "I kept you out of jail for one night." I raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" She nodded. I made a call. "To who?" "Artemis." That got my attention. Megan leaned one shoulder against the counter beside the bed. "Left him a message," she said. "Told him you'll need him to meet you at the 132nd. The courthouse. Also told him to bring your bail stash." I stared at her. "You're getting comfortable giving legal advice now?" She shrugged. I also told him Dennis Halpern was the arresting officer. That piece of information hung in the room for a second. Artemis would know exactly what that meant. Megan pushed away from the counter and stepped closer to the bed. "Your scans look clean," she said. "Head's hard enough to survive a small war, apparently." "Been told that before." She leaned in slightly and pressed a quick kiss to my forehead. "Try not to make a habit of it." Then she straightened up and shifted position beside the bed. The double doors at the end of the ER hallway swung open. Dennis Halpern stepped through them, coat already on, looking like a man who'd been awake just as long as the rest of us. Megan noticed him immediately. She glanced back down at me, then turned toward Dennis as he approached the room. "Well," she said casually. "See, all safe and sound, Detective." The ride over to the 132nd Precinct was quiet. Too quiet. Dennis kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, the early morning light sliding across the windshield in long, pale streaks. The city was just starting to wake up. Delivery trucks, the smell of coffee drifting out of corner diners, people pretending it was going to be a normal day. Inside the car, neither of us said a word. I could tell Dennis had been wrestling with this all night. You don't spend years working cases with someone without learning how they think when they're silent. We pulled into the lot behind the 132nd and went through the usual routine. Booking desk, a quick walk through the bullpen, a couple uniforms looking up from their paperwork like they'd just spotted a ghost. "Morning, Keller." Nobody sounded happy to see me. Dennis walked me down the hall and pushed open the door to interview room 2. Same gray walls. Same steel table bolted to the floor. Same chair that always felt about 2 inches too small, no matter who sat in it. He uncuffed me from the transport chain and motioned toward the chair. "Sit." I sat. Dennis stepped out, the door closing behind him with that familiar hollow click. For a minute, the room stayed quiet. Just the low hum of the fluorescent light overhead. I leaned back and stared at the blank wall across the table, waiting. The door opened again. Dennis stepped inside and shut it behind him. He didn't sit down right away, just stood there for a moment, like he was deciding how to start the conversation. Finally, he pulled the chair across from me and sat. "All right, Marty." The door behind him burst open. Both of us turned. Artemis Chadwick Bozeman filled the doorway like someone had tried to cram a small truck into a suit jacket. 350 pounds of irritated defense attorney breathing hard from the walk down the hallway, blonde hair sticking out in every direction like he'd fought a pillow and lost. He carried a laptop bag under one arm and a legal folder thick enough to stop a bullet in the other. "Fantastic," Artemis said. "An interrogation already in progress and not a single phone call to counsel." Dennis rubbed a hand across his face. "Artemis, this is a police investigation." "Which you just contaminated," Artemis interrupted, waddling into the room and dropping his bag on the table with a heavy thud. He turned toward me. "You say anything yet?" I shook my head. "Good," he said. Then he turned slowly back to Dennis. "Now that we're all properly acquainted with the Sixth Amendment," Artemis continued, lowering himself into the chair beside me with a groan of protesting metal. "Why don't we start over?" He folded his hands across the folder. "Detective," he said calmly, "my client and I are listening." The room went quiet after Artemis spoke. Dennis leaned back in his chair, studying both of us like he was deciding whether to be annoyed or impressed. "Nice entrance," Dennis said. Artemis adjusted his glasses and slid the folder open in front of him. "Thank you," he replied. "I try to arrive before my clients incriminate themselves." Dennis ignored that and looked straight at me. "Marty, we're going to keep this simple." Artemis raised a finger. "No," he said calmly. "We're going to keep this legal." Dennis exhaled slowly. I could see the fatigue sitting behind his eyes. This wasn't the version of the morning he wanted either. He shifted his attention back to me. "Let's start with Connie Mackland." Artemis immediately leaned forward. "We will not." Dennis looked at him. "You don't get to decide that." "Yes, I do," Artemis said. "If the question leads to self-incrimination, conflicts with an ongoing investigation, or touches on protected communications with my client." Dennis tapped a pen against the table. "Marty has been living with her." Artemis shrugged. "Adults sometimes do that." Dennis slid a photograph across the table. It showed me walking into Connie's house. Nighttime. 2 weeks ago. Another photo followed. Morning. Me leaving. Dennis placed a third one down. Different day. Same house, same door. Same mistake. "You didn't disclose the relationship," Dennis said. I looked at the pictures but didn't say anything. Inside my head, the gears were turning. 3 weeks of photos. Someone had been watching me a lot longer than I realized. Artemis pushed the pictures aside with 2 fingers. "Detective, unless you're planning to charge my client with the crime of sleeping indoors, we're going to need something more compelling." Dennis ignored him. "Marty," he said, "Connie Mackland is directly tied to the Hawthorne investigation." I kept my voice even. "I'm aware." Dennis leaned forward. "Yet you continued to live in her house." Artemis raised his hand again. "Objection." Dennis blinked. "This isn't a courtroom." Artemis smiled slightly. "Practice makes perfect." Dennis tried again. "You understand how that looks." I shrugged. "Looks like a roof." Dennis's jaw tightened. "You submitted evidence in the Hawthorne case." "Correct." "And during that time, you were residing with a connected party." Artemis cut in immediately. "Detective Halpern, unless you can demonstrate my client altered, fabricated, or withheld evidence, you're speculating about bias, not proving misconduct." Dennis tapped the USB evidence bag on the table. "That brings us to this." The little black drive sat between us like it had its own gravity. My stomach tightened. Dennis looked directly at me. "You had a conversation with Federal Agent Jackson about this USB drive." I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him anything. Artemis leaned slightly toward Dennis. "Careful." Dennis continued anyway. "You said the word USB first." The room felt smaller suddenly. I remembered that conversation. Jackson had played it smooth. Too smooth. Dennis watched my face. Once you said it, he continued. He just kept you talking. Artemis raised his palm. And that's where we stop. Dennis looked at him. You don't want your client to explain himself? Artemis shook his head slowly. My client doesn't explain anything inside interrogation rooms. Dennis leaned back. Marty, the feds believe you interfered with their investigation. Artemis answered before I could. They believe many things. Dennis ignored him. You took possession of federal evidence. No charge has been filed regarding that, Artemis said. You compromised a federal witness. No evidence supports that claim. Dennis looked back at me. And last night, you walked into the apartment of that witness and triggered a bomb. The words hung in the air. Inside my head, something clicked. Not about the bomb, about the timing, the envelope, the photos. 3 weeks of surveillance. Someone had been building a case against me before that door ever blew open. Artemis leaned back in his chair. Detective, he said calmly. Let's review the facts. He ticked them off with thick fingers. My client received a call for help. Correct, Dennis admitted. He responded. Yes, a bomb exploded. Dennis didn't answer that one. Artemis continued. My client nearly died. Dennis stared at him. And now you're attempting to frame his rescue attempt as interference. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Dennis rubbed his forehead. You're missing the bigger issue. Artemis tilted his head. Which is? Dennis pointed at me. Everything around this man keeps exploding. I almost laughed. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and stared at the steel tabletop. The room smelled like stale coffee and old paint. Dennis kept talking. Artemis kept blocking him. But most of it was just noise now. Because something about last night didn't sit right. The timing, the call, the evacuation already underway when I got there. And somehow, out of everyone involved, I was the one sitting in this chair. That wasn't luck. That was design. Someone had moved the pieces on the board before any of us even knew we were playing. And right now, I was the one taking the fall for it. Artemis set his cell phone flat on the steel table. Then he stood. The chair groaned under the sudden relief of his weight as he pushed it back. He adjusted his glasses slowly and looked at Dennis like a teacher about to explain something painfully simple to a stubborn student. Let's stop pretending for a moment, Artemis said evenly. Dennis didn't like the tone already. And understand, Artemis continued, that you are currently the person with the lowest IQ in this room. Detective? You could see the color rise in Dennis's face almost immediately. That kind of insult didn't come out of nowhere. It carried history. A lot of it. The three of us had crossed paths more times than anyone cared to count, and none of those meetings had ended pleasantly. Dennis leaned forward in his chair. You want to be real careful how you... Artemis held up a hand. No, he said calmly. You want to be careful. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the air had thickened. Artemis rested both hands on the table. We're going to keep this simple, he said. For you. Dennis glared across the table but didn't interrupt. Martin Keller, Artemis continued, nodding toward me, has not and will not incriminate himself. He tapped the legal folder once. You have formally charged him with activities unbecoming of a licensed investigator. He shrugged. Fine. We will defend ourselves in front of a board of inquiry. His finger slid slightly across the table toward Dennis. Not you. Dennis clenched his jaw. Charge 2, Artemis continued without missing a beat. Interference with an ongoing federal investigation. Another shrug. If that claim holds water, then we will address it at the federal level." Dennis opened his mouth to respond, but Artemis kept going. "And now we arrive at the part where you have made your biggest mistake." He glanced briefly at his phone sitting on the table, then back to Dennis. "You have already held my client for more than 24 hours. Dennis leaned forward immediately. "That's not accurate." Artemis cut him off. "Really?" Dennis stopped. Artemis gestured toward me. "Martin Keller was placed in handcuffs last night." Dennis tried again. "He was in a hospital." "Still in handcuffs," Artemis replied sharply. The room went quiet. Even the fluorescent lights above us seemed louder. Dennis knew exactly what Artemis was doing. Building a record. Every second of this conversation mattered. Artemis leaned forward slightly. "You transported him to Riverbend Memorial and left him restrained under police authority." Dennis's silence confirmed the point. Artemis spread his hands across the table. "So yes," he said quietly. "The clock started when you put those cuffs on him." The room felt like it had filled with static electricity. Dennis stared at him. Artemis stared back, neither one blinking. From my chair, I watched the blue notification light on Artemis's cell phone blink once on the table beside the evidence Dennis had stacked there. The photos, the USB drive, my life. The blue light blinked again, then went dark. Artemis finally straightened up. "I demand," he said calmly, "that you release Martin Keller into my custody immediately." The room stayed silent. Dennis didn't move, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Chapter 5, Sinclair, January 25th, 2026. By the time they released me into Artemis's custody, I had lost 48 hours of investigation time. In my line of work, that might as well be a month. Night had already taken over the day when we stepped out of the front doors of the 132nd Precinct. The streetlights buzzed overhead, and the cold air carried that familiar Riverbend smell. Exhaust, rain on asphalt, and diner grease drifting from somewhere down Main. Artemis let out a low chuckle beside me. "That," he said, stretching his shoulders, "felt fantastic." I glanced over at him. "Yeah." He nodded back toward the precinct. "Been waiting to put Halpern in his place since freshman year." That made me smirk. I knew exactly what he meant. The three of us had grown up in the same hallways at Riverbend High. Dennis Halpern had been the clean-cut class president type. Football jacket. Perfect attendance. Teachers loved him. Artemis Bozeman had been the kid who could hack the school grading server before lunch and argue constitutional law with the principal after. And me? I mostly stayed somewhere in the middle of it all, watching the two of them go at each other like rival chess players who hated the same board. Some things never change. "You hungry?" Artemis asked. "Yeah," I said. "Haven't eaten since yesterday morning." "Good." He hit the unlock button. "Jerry's is open." We walked over to his SUV parked under a streetlight, a 2024 Ford Explorer that looked less like a vehicle and more like something a surveillance van had a baby with. He climbed in, and the interior lit up like a command center. 3 mounted screens, signal scanners, external drives stacked into a rack system behind the center console, cables everywhere. I stared at it. "Jesus, Art." He froze, slowly turned his head toward me. "What?" he said carefully. "Have I told you about calling me Art?" I leaned back in the seat. "That your name is Artemis." "Correct. Still sounds like a Greek god." "Goddess," he corrected while pulling onto Main Street. "Even worse." The Explorer hummed forward through the late-night traffic, while the neon lights of Riverbend slid across the windshield. For a minute, we just drove. Then Artemis glanced over at me. "All right," he said. "Start talking." "About?" "Your investigation." I watched the city pass by outside my window for a moment, trying to sort the pieces in my head. Witness named Laura Vance, I said finally, connected to Rupert Hawthorne. Artemis nodded. The same Hawthorne that just posted bail. Yeah. And? She called me last night. What about? Said she wasn't safe. Artemis absorbed that without reacting. And that's when the bomb went off. Yeah. He drove another block before speaking again. You realize something doesn't add up. I let out a slow breath. I've been realizing that since the door exploded. He tapped the steering wheel thoughtfully. Good. Because if someone planted that bomb, he glanced over at me. They didn't just want Laura Vance dead. Outside the windshield, the red neon sign for Jerry's Diner came into view. Artemis turned into the parking lot and shut off the engine. What makes you say that? I asked. He grabbed his laptop bag. Because, he said, opening the door, you were the one sitting in the interrogation room tonight. He stepped out into the cold air. Which means someone worked very hard to make sure of it. Linda spotted us the moment we stepped inside the diner. The bell over the door gave its usual tired jingle as the warm smell of coffee and grilled onions wrapped around us. She smiled the kind of smile that comes from knowing the regulars before they even sit down, and pointed toward an open booth near the back. I'll be right with you, she said, already reaching for 2 coffee mugs behind the counter. Artemis and I slid into the booth. Old habits kicked in without thinking. I took the seat facing the door. Artemis didn't bother arguing. He knew better by now. Linda came by a second later and set 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the table. Long night, she asked. You could say that, I replied. We'll eat something before you fall over, she said, tapping the menus down in front of us before heading back toward the counter. The diner was quiet. Just a truck driver nursing a pie at the far end, and the hum of the neon sign outside buzzing through the glass. We flipped through the menus for a minute. Then I looked over at Artemis. So, I said, what did you take in there? Artemis didn't look up from the menu right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and set his cell phone on the table, the same one he'd placed down during the interrogation. He smiled. I needed a copy of the files on the USB. I lowered the menu slowly. You're kidding. He shook his head. No. I stared at the phone. You cloned federal evidence. Technically, Artemis said calmly, I made a duplicate of data that was unlawfully being used against my client without proper discovery procedure. That sounds like the same thing. Semantics. I leaned back in the booth. How? Artemis tapped the phone lightly. Near-field data transfer. The drive was in an evidence bag. Plastic, he said. That's not a barrier. Linda returned just then with a notepad. What'll it be? Artemis didn't even glance at the menu. 2 eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast. She looked at me. Same. She scribbled the order down and disappeared again. I looked back at Artemis. You did all that while arguing with Dennis. He shrugged, multitasking. The blue light on his phone blinked once, then the screen lit up. Data transfer complete. Artemis turned the phone toward me. You want to know something interesting? He said. What? He tapped the screen. The USB drive Dennis thinks proves you interfered with a federal investigation. The files opened one by one. Isn't federal evidence at all. I sat there staring at him for a moment. Blank. The kind of blank that comes when your brain is trying to catch up with information it didn't expect. Artemis didn't seem bothered by the silence. He picked up the coffee mug Linda had dropped off and took a slow sip, like he was reading the morning paper, instead of dismantling a federal case. Not only that, he continued, turning the phone slightly so the glow from the screen lit the booth between us. There are 2 logger and tracking programs embedded on the drive. I leaned forward a little. Tracking? Artemis nodded. 2 of them. He tapped the screen and a block of code appeared. One is military grade. I stared at the lines scrolling past. What does that mean? It means, Artemis said calmly, someone used a very expensive piece of software designed to monitor access activity. He swiped again. This one logs timestamps, device signatures, geographic ping responses, basically every system that touches the drive. So whoever plugs it in gets tracked. Correct. Linda slid 2 plates onto the table while he was talking. Eggs, bacon, hash browns. Neither of us looked up. She glanced at the screen for half a second and shook her head. You 2 need a hobby, she muttered, before heading back to the counter. Artemis continued like she hadn't spoken. The second program is the interesting one. He zoomed in on another section of code. This one isn't military. What is it? He smirked slightly. Custom. Custom how? Artemis tapped the screen again. This code structure, the architecture, the way it handles packet mirroring. He looked up at me. This is genius-level work. I frowned. You saying some hacker planted it? No. He leaned back in the booth. I'm saying whoever wrote this thinks like I do. I picked up my coffee. And that's bad? He nodded slowly. Very. Why? Because, he said, pointing at the phone again. This is exactly the kind of surveillance program I would write. I stared at him. You didn't write it. Artemis shook his head. No. He took another sip of coffee. But whoever did, he turned the screen back toward me, knew exactly how someone like me would try to break into it. I sat back in the booth and pushed the plate a little farther away. The eggs were still steaming, but suddenly I wasn't very hungry. I opened that drive once, I said. Artemis looked up from the phone. When? 3 weeks ago. His expression tightened. Where? My office. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. Right after we took possession of it from Coderson Holdings. Artemis nodded slowly. From Elliot Crane. Yeah. I took a sip of coffee. That drive already had the software on it the day we got it. Artemis leaned forward again, eyes narrowing slightly, as he studied the code scrolling across his phone. So the trackers weren't added after it was stolen, he said. No. They were there from the beginning. Exactly. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Well, he said quietly, that changes the picture. How? He tapped the screen again, pulling up the first block of code. The military-grade logger. That program records every system that accesses the drive. I nodded. That's how Ajax knew I opened it. Right, he scrolled again. And the second program, the custom one. The genius one, I said. Artemis nodded. That code was already embedded when Elliot Crane handed the drive over. I stared at him. So, Coderson Holdings gave us a drive that was already tracking anyone who touched it. Correct. Linda walked by and topped off our coffee without asking. Artemis continued. That means every system that accessed this drive since day 1 has been logged somewhere. I leaned back slightly. Coderson Holdings. Your office. And now the 132nd precinct, Artemis added. I looked up at him. Dennis opened it. Inside a police-grade secure network. Artemis locked the phone screen and set it back on the table. So whoever embedded this software, he said calmly, has been watching this investigation since the moment Elliot Crane handed you that USB. I stared out through the diner window, neon lights flickering across the glass, traffic moving slowly down Main Street. 3 weeks. 3 weeks someone had been watching every step we took. I looked back at Artemis. So whoever wrote that code, he nodded once, has been inside this case longer than we have. Artemis locked his phone and slid it back across the table. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The diner hummed quietly around us, coffee cups clinking, the low rattle of plates in the kitchen, the neon sign outside buzzing like it always did. 3 weeks. Someone had been watching this investigation for 3 weeks. Linda stopped by once more, topping off the coffee without asking. She gave us a look that said we both looked like hell and kept walking. Artemis finished the last bite of bacon and wiped his hands with a napkin. Then he leaned back in the booth and looked across at me. "So," he said, "where am I dropping you tonight?" I raised an eyebrow. "Options." He held up 2 fingers. "Connie's." He lowered one. "Or Dr. Davis's." I stared at him. "You've been taking notes on my personal life now?" Artemis shrugged. "Professional curiosity." Then he added casually, "Megan has your bike, by the way." That caught my attention. "The Indian?" He took a sip of coffee. "Ajax dropped it off for you earlier." I frowned. "When?" "While you were in the hospital." That sat with me for a second. Ajax had made sure my bike made it across town. Didn't say anything about it. Just handled it. Artemis watched my reaction. "Interesting friend you've got there." I leaned back in the booth. "Yeah." Outside the diner window, the streetlights painted long shadows across the empty parking lot. Artemis tossed a few bills on the table and stood up. "Come on," he said, "before Linda decides we're renting the booth." We stepped out into the cold night air again. The black Explorer waited under the glow of the parking lot lights. Artemis opened the driver's door and looked across the roof at me. "So," he asked again, "Connie's or Dr. Davis's?" I looked out toward Main Street for a moment, then back at him. "Take me to the bike." Artemis smirked slightly. "Thought you might say that." Chapter 6, Sinclair, A, January 25th, 2026. We slid into the Explorer and Artemis fired up the command center. The dashboard came alive. Monitors hummed as lines of code began sliding across the screens during the custom boot sequence. External drives spun up. Signal scanners lit the cabin in faint blue light. The thing looked less like an SUV and more like a rolling server rack. Artemis shifted the truck into gear and pulled us out of Jerry's parking lot toward downtown. That's when I noticed the headlights across the street from Jerry's. Black, low, familiar. A blacked-out Delta 88 rolled off the curb and eased into the street behind us after giving us about a 10-second head start. Artemis saw it in the side mirror. He laughed. "Standard protocol." I shook my head. "You did that on purpose." He glanced over at me with the same calm expression he used in court when he was about to ruin someone's day. "While we were eating," he said, tapping one of the monitors, "I activated the tracking software embedded in the USB. Lines of telemetry began populating across the screen. The moment that drive wakes up on a system," he continued, "anyone watching it gets a signal." I looked back in the side mirror at the Delta. "So you lit a flare?" "Exactly." He adjusted the mirror slightly, watching the car settle into a comfortable trailing distance. "Then we waited to see who would show up." The Delta stayed right where it was behind us. Not too close, not too far. Ajax knew how to follow someone without looking like he was following them. Artemis smirked. "Think of it this way." He tapped another key and a map of Riverbend lit up on the center monitor. "If someone has been watching that drive for 3 weeks..." I stepped out of Artemis's SUV and shut the door behind me. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the roof of the vehicle. The monitors inside still glowed faint blue through the windshield. Artemis rested his forearm on the steering wheel. "I got it, Marty," he said. "I'll start working your defense with the board." He nodded toward the laptop bag sitting beside him. "In the meantime, I've got my systems chewing through that USB drive. I gave a small nod. Answer your phone when I call. Understood. I stepped back from the vehicle. Talk to you in a few days. Artemis pulled away from the curb, the Explorer's headlights sliding down the quiet street before disappearing around the corner. I turned toward the house. 5 years ago, Megan and I had bought it together. Technically, the paperwork had my name on it, but the place had always been hers. Her dream. White siding, wraparound porch, a small oak tree she insisted on planting the first week we moved in. The porch light was still on. Some habits never die. I walked up the steps slowly and knocked on the door. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps inside. The lock turned. The door opened just enough for Megan Davis to look out. Her red hair was pulled back into a loose knot, and she was wearing an oversized sweatshirt that probably used to be mine. She studied me for a second. "You look like hell," she said. "Been a long couple days." Her eyes moved over the bruising around my jaw and the bandage peeking out from under my collar. "Halpern finally let you go?" "On bail." She opened the door wider. "Well," she said, stepping aside, "so you might as well come in before the neighbors start talking." I stepped inside. The house still smelled the same, coffee, antiseptic, and the faint scent of cedar from the floors Megan insisted on refinishing herself the first year we moved in. My eyes went straight to the kitchen table. The Colt sat there, partly disassembled. Next to it was my navy peacoat, folded in a sad heap that looked like it had been through a wood chipper. I remembered then. The EMTs had cut it open. The wool was sliced from collar to hem. Megan noticed where my attention landed. She leaned against the counter and crossed her arms. "Bad news first," she said. I walked over and picked up the pistol frame. The metal felt wrong immediately. Too stiff. Too tight. "The 1911, she said quietly. "I think the frame's bent from the blast." I tried working the slide. Nothing. Frozen solid. "I couldn't get the slide to eject," she continued. "It's locked up." I looked down at it a moment longer. That pistol had been with me longer than most of the people in my life. Military issue. A lot of miles. A lot of bad nights. Now it looked like it had finally met something meaner than both of us. I set the pieces back on the table. "Guess it took the hit for me." Megan studied my face. "That's one way to look at it." I ran my hand across the ruined peacoat. "EMTs cut it off me." She nodded. "Yeah. Figured." The house went quiet for a moment. Then Megan pushed off the counter and walked over. "Sit down," she said. "You look like someone ran you through a drywall saw." I pulled out the chair and sat. She opened the fridge. "You hungry?" I gave a tired smile. "Just ate at Jerry's." She glanced over her shoulder. "With Artemis?" "Yeah." She nodded, like that answered everything. It probably did. Then she shut the fridge door and leaned against it. "So," she said, "you want to tell me why half the city thinks you blew up an apartment building?" A painful smile crept across my face. "Well," I said slowly, "I kind of did." Megan raised an eyebrow. "That's not the reassurance I was hoping for." I rubbed the back of my neck and leaned forward on the table. "The part that keeps bothering me," I said, "is how it all went down." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat. "Start talking." I stared down at the bent frame of the Colt for a second before answering. "Laura Vance called me." Megan nodded. "Right. You told me that much at the hospital." "Yeah." I exhaled slowly. "But Ajax said he got a call from her, too." That made Megan pause. "Both of you?" "Yeah." I tapped my finger lightly on the table. She called me saying she wasn't safe. And Ajax said the same thing. Megan leaned back in the chair, thinking. "And you both showed up. Within minutes of each other." The room went quiet for a moment. Rain had started tapping lightly against the kitchen window. "And neither of you got her out," Megan said. I shook my head. "No." I looked up at her. "That's the part that keeps bugging me." "Why?" "Because everything about it felt." I searched for the word. "Convenient." Megan tilted her head slightly. "How so?" I leaned back in the chair and stared up at the ceiling. "She calls 2 investigators separately. Both of us rush over, and the moment I grab the door handle..." I paused. The place explodes. Megan watched me carefully. "You think someone was waiting for you?" I slowly shook my head. "No." I looked back at her. "I think someone knew we'd both be there." I let out a long sigh and leaned back in the chair. "Hawthorne must have gotten to her," I said. Megan's eyes stayed on me, but she didn't interrupt. "Only thing that makes sense," I continued. "He gets to her first, forces her to make the calls, gets me and Ajax both in the same place." I rubbed a hand across my face. 2 investigators, 1 apartment. My eyes drifted back to the bent frame of the Colt sitting on the table. "Then boom!" Megan didn't look convinced. "You really believe that?" I shrugged slightly. "It fits." She folded her arms on the table. "Hawthorne's a lot of things," she said, "but planting a bomb big enough to take out half a floor of an apartment building? He's got money. So do a lot of people." I sat there quietly for a moment. She was right, but the alternative didn't sit any better. "What's the other option?" I asked. Megan studied my face carefully before answering. "That it wasn't Hawthorne." The rain against the window had picked up now, tapping harder against the glass. I shook my head. "No." "Why not?" "Because if it wasn't him," I said slowly, "then whoever set that bomb knew 2 things." Megan waited. I leaned forward again. "They knew I'd answer the phone. And they knew Ajax would too." The room went quiet again. Megan glanced toward the ruined peacoat on the table, then back to me. "That sounds less like intimidation," she said softly, "and more like planning." I didn't answer right away, because the longer I thought about it, the less I liked where the idea was going. I looked up at her. "Is my old coat still down in the study?" Megan gave me a look like I'd just asked if the sun was still coming up in the morning. "Yes," she said. "It's down in the study." "Good." I stood up from the table. "Ajax is sitting down the road. I need to go talk to him." She didn't ask how I knew that. She'd been around this life long enough. "Is it all right if I leave the bike here overnight?" "Of course," she said. "Thank you, Megan." For a moment, I caught myself leaning toward her out of pure habit. 5 years of muscle memory doesn't disappear overnight. Halfway through the motion, something in my chest tightened, and I stopped myself. The moment passed between us quietly. I nodded once and turned away. The study was just down the hallway. When I stepped inside, it felt like opening a room that had been sealed for years. The furniture was still where we'd left it. The desk pushed against the window, the old bookcase along the wall. My old black peacoat hung on the rack in the corner. I walked over and lifted it down. Still heavy. Still smelled faintly of wool and winter. I opened the closet and pulled one of my old suits from the hanger. A few minutes later, I was dressed again. Different man. Same problems. I opened the desk drawer and pulled the small steel case forward. Inside sat the 2 Smith & Wesson M40s, clean, oiled, waiting. I checked each one out of habit and slipped them into the arm-sling pockets of the peacoat. The weight felt familiar. Grounding. When I slid my hand into the inside pocket, I felt a soft cardboard edge. I pulled it out. A pack of Lucky Strikes. About 3 years past their prime. I stared at them for a second before chuckling quietly to myself. Still there, I tucked them back into the coat. Sometimes it's good to know something hasn't moved. I stepped back into the kitchen. I'm heading out, I said. Megan looked up from the sink. Be careful. Always. Good night, Marty. Good night, Megan. I stepped out the front door and into the cold night air. The neighborhood was quiet. Most houses dark. Street lights humming above the road. 2 houses down sat the Delta 88. Lights off, motor cold. Ajax was good. I didn't walk straight toward it. Instead, I circled around the back of the house, cut through the neighbor's yard, and came up the street from the opposite side. By the time I reached the car, I was standing beside the passenger door. I leaned down slowly and tapped the window once with my knuckle. Not even a twitch from him when my knuckles rapped the window. Ajax had ice water in his veins. The passenger window rolled down slowly. No surprise, no tension. Just that same calm expression sitting behind the wheel, like he'd been expecting me the whole time. About time, he said. Get yourself in the car. I opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The interior smelled faintly of leather and coffee that had been sitting too long in a thermos. The door shut with a dull thud. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Ajax kept his eyes on the windshield. You always sneak up on federal agents from the blind side, he said. Or just tonight? Just tonight. He nodded slightly. Good to know. I leaned back in the seat. You've been sitting out here a while. Since Jerry's. Figured. The street light above us cast long shadows across the hood of the Delta. Finally, Ajax turned his head toward me. You look like you lost a fight with a building. Apartment door. Explains the helmet. I watched him for a moment. You got my bike over to Megan's. He shrugged. Didn't want it sitting in evidence. Appreciate it. Another quiet pause. Then I said the thing that had been sitting in my head all night. You told me Laura called you. Ajax nodded once. Yeah, same thing she told me. Pretty much. Not safe. Right. I stared through the windshield. And we both showed up. Yep. I slowly turned my head toward him. That doesn't bother you? Ajax didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached forward and flicked the dashboard light on for a second, then off again. Thinking. Finally, he spoke. Everything about this case bothers me. He looked at me, but that's not the question you're really asking. I leaned back in the seat. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The car sat there in silence for another moment. Then Ajax said the one thing I'd been wondering since the explosion. You think she set you up? Ajax kept his eyes on the road as the Delta rolled toward downtown. For a while, neither of us said anything. Finally, I broke the silence. Forensics hasn't come back yet on the body in Laura Vance's apartment. Ajax nodded once. Not yet. That information is going to matter. Yeah, he said quietly. It will. I watched the streetlight slide across the windshield. Look, I said after a moment, if I'm going to be part of this investigation, we're going to have to make it legitimate. Ajax glanced over at me. How do you figure? Dennis already found out about Connie Mackland. Ajax's jaw tightened slightly. That's not good. No, I said. It isn't. I leaned back in the seat. Everything I've turned over to Riverbend PD is useless now. Biased evidence, Ajax said. Exactly. And Halpern is trying to charge you with interference. Yeah. The Delta slowed as we turned onto the street where my office building sat, half under scaffolding and plywood. Ajax parked along the curb but left the engine running. So what's the play? He asked. I stared up at the dark windows of the building. The play, I said slowly, is that I stop being the investigator. Ajax turned toward me. And start being what? I reached for the door handle. Your witness. Ajax paused for a second. The Delta idled quietly at the curb while he thought it over. "All right," he said finally. "If we do this, we do it my way." I waited. "First," he said, "the arrest is mine." I nodded once. "That puts you inside the investigation legally. Federal oversight." He held up a second finger. "Two, every dollar you've made on this case disappears." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Ajax said flatly. "You're not getting paid for anything connected to Hawthorne, Vance, or Coderson." He glanced at me. "If you're taking the stand as a witness, there can't be a financial incentive tied to your investigation." I leaned back against the seat. "That's going to hurt. Better your wallet than your license." He paused again. "You're still stuck with the Connie Mackland problem," he added. I didn't respond. Ajax shook his head slightly. "Honestly, Keller, that one serves you right." He looked over at me. "You know better than getting involved with a client." I didn't argue. Didn't have much ground to stand on anyway. "Fair enough," I said. Ajax nodded once. "And Marty." He turned the key and killed the engine. "Stay the hell away from Hawthorne." I gave a tired half-smile. "I'll try." We stepped out of the Delta and walked toward the building. The plywood around the lower windows creaked slightly in the wind as we pushed through the front door and climbed the stairwell. Drywall dust still hung faintly in the air. My office door stood at the end of the hallway, the faded gold lettering still clinging to the glass. Marty Martin, Private Investigator, LLC. Ajax stopped beside me as we stepped inside. The place looked like a construction zone that had lost a fight with a hurricane. He glanced around once, then looked back at me. "Happy February 1st, he said. Something in his voice told me it wasn't meant as a greeting, more like a warning. Chapter 7. Sinclair, January 25th, 2026. Morning came in through the cracked blinds like it had something to prove. I woke up stiff on the office couch with the smell of fresh coffee cutting through the drywall dust. When I sat up, a cup of hot coffee was already sitting on the small table in front of me. Steam curled lazily toward the ceiling. Ajax stood near the window holding a paper bag. "Morning," he said. "Omar's cart," he added, nodding toward the cup. "Corner of Monroe and Franklin." I grabbed the coffee and took a sip. Strong, hot, exactly what the doctor would have ordered if the doctor was a street vendor with a steel cart and a permanent cigarette hanging from his lip. Ajax reached into the paper bag and tossed something toward me. I caught it. Breakfast sandwich, egg, bacon, and something pretending to be cheese. "Thought you might still be alive," he said. "Barely." I sat up slowly and stretched the knots out of my shoulders. The office looked worse in daylight. Drywall patches, bullet holes still half filled. Plastic over the fire escape window. Real estate agents would have called it character. I walked over to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside sat the envelope where I kept the case payments. I pulled it out and spread the money across the desk. What was left of it anyway? I counted it once, then again. Finally, I took what remained and slipped it back into the drawer, replacing the envelope with a small IOU note. Next, I grabbed the Sinclair retainer. Mrs. Sinclair had paid in cash. I counted it out carefully. Every dollar. Then I placed it into the same envelope Elliot Crane had paid me with when I first walked into Coderson Holdings. Ajax watched the whole thing from the window. "You cleaning your books?" "Something like that." He nodded. "Smart move." I sealed the envelope. "Drop me off at Megan's," I said. "Why?" "I'll take the bike from there and swing by Coderson." "Returning the money?" "Yeah." Ajax raised an eyebrow. "That's not like you." "Things change." He shrugged and grabbed his coat. "All right." We headed down the stairs and out into the cold morning air. Riverbend was just starting to wake up. Delivery trucks, early commuters, the smell of coffee drifting through the street. Ajax dropped me off near Megan's house. "Meet me at my office when you're done," he said. "We'll file the paperwork." I nodded. "Sounds good." The Delta pulled away while I walked up the street toward the bike. A few minutes later, the Indian roared to life beneath me. Coderson Holdings wasn't far. Glass building, corporate steel, the kind of place that tried very hard to look clean. I stepped inside and walked up to the front desk. Veronica sat behind it, just like always. Late 20s, sharp eyes, dark hair pulled back tight enough to mean business. She'd been working that desk long enough to know exactly who belonged in the building and who didn't. She looked up from her computer and gave me a small smile. "Mr. Keller," she said. "Back again." "Morning, Veronica." She tilted her head slightly. "You here to see Mr. Crane?" "Yeah." She tapped a few keys and picked up the phone. "Mr. Crane, Martin Keller is here to see you." A pause. Then she hung up and nodded toward the elevator. "He's expecting you." "Thanks." I stepped into the elevator and rode it up. Crane's office sat at the far end of the floor like it owned the view. He looked up from his desk when I walked in. "Mr. Keller," he said pleasantly. "I wasn't expecting you this morning." I didn't sit down. Instead, I placed the envelope on his desk and slid it toward him. "What's this?" he asked. "Your money." Crane's smile held for a moment, then faded just slightly. "I'm sorry. I can't take the case." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "That's unfortunate." I shrugged. Conflict of interest. Crane opened the envelope slowly and glanced at the money inside. His expression stayed perfectly neutral, but something behind his eyes shifted. Just a flicker. Concern. "Did something change in the investigation?" he asked casually. "Yeah." "What would that be?" "I'm no longer working the case." Crane nodded slowly. "I see." He closed the envelope. "You're certain about this?" "Yeah." A quiet moment passed between us. Crane gave a polite smile. "Well," he said, "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Keller." But while he said it, his fingers rested on the envelope like it had suddenly become heavier than he expected. As I rode out of the Coderson Holdings campus, I caught sight of a gray Bentley easing toward the parking garage. I knew that car. Rupert Hawthorne's. It moved slow and smooth like it owned the pavement. The tinted windows gave nothing away, but the message was clear enough. Hawthorne was already back in the city, already moving. The Bentley disappeared down into the concrete ramp of the garage without a sound. I sat on the Indian for a second, the engine rumbling beneath me while I watched the empty driveway where it had been. Figures. Man makes bail, and the first place he shows up is Coderson Holdings. That alone was worth remembering. But right now, I had somewhere else to be. I kicked the Indian into gear and pulled out onto the street. Ajax was waiting for me down at the FBI field office. The cold wind cut through the city as I rode across Riverbend, doing a better job waking me up than Omar's coffee ever did. Traffic had thickened since morning. Office workers, delivery trucks, people heading to jobs that didn't involve bombs, federal agents, or missing women. Must be nice. The federal building came into view a few minutes later. Concrete. Steel. The kind of place that didn't bother pretending to be welcoming. I rolled into the visitor parking and killed the engine. The Indian ticked quietly as it cooled. I swung off the bike and headed toward the entrance. Ajax was already inside somewhere, waiting to turn my mess of a case into something the Bureau could officially touch. Chapter 8. Sinclair. A January 25th, 2026. The February air outside the federal building bit a little harder than it had that morning. I stepped onto the sidewalk and pulled my collar up. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Artemis," I answered. "Yeah." "Marty," he said, already sounding like his brain was running faster than the rest of the world. "You need to come by the office." That about the USB? A pause. Yes. That good or bad? Depends how you define good, I sighed. I'll be there. Soon, he said. Not tomorrow. The line went dead. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, swung onto the Indian, and brought the engine to life. The bike rumbled under me as I pulled out into the street and headed toward downtown. Riverbend traffic had started to thicken. Delivery vans, office workers, people with places to be that didn't involve bombs or federal agents. I made it 3 blocks before something started to itch in the back of my mind. The sedan behind me had followed through 2 lights. Could have been coincidence. 3rd light turned yellow. I rolled through. The sedan followed. That was enough for me. I turned down an alley behind a row of old brick warehouses. The Indian echoed off the walls as I pushed deeper into the narrow lane. Halfway down, I slowed and rolled the bike sideways near a stack of dumpsters. My hand slipped inside my coat and found the grip of one of the Smith & Wessons. The sedan slid into the alley behind me. Doors opened. 2 men stepped out. One of them I didn't recognize. The other one didn't need an introduction. Scar. Frankie. Scar Marconi looked exactly the way I remembered him. Mean, confident, and a little too happy to see me. Well, Scar said, spreading his hands a little. Keller. I kept the gun low but ready. You're moving around pretty quick for a guy who just made bail. Scar grinned. Had some business to take care of. The other man stayed near the car. Quiet. Watching. Scar took another step toward me. I saw his hand move toward his coat. I didn't wait. The shot cracked through the alley. Scar jerked sideways and slammed into the brick wall behind him, dropping to one knee with a grunt. The other man disappeared behind the sedan so fast it almost looked rehearsed. Scar clutched his side, blood starting to spread through his jacket. I stepped closer, keeping the gun trained on him. Talk. Scar laughed once. It turned into a cough. You always did shoot first, he muttered. I crouched down in front of him. Why were you following me? Scar looked up at me with that same crooked grin. You really think this is about Hawthorne? My stomach tightened a little. Then who? He shook his head slowly. This thing goes way past Hawthorne, Keller. I leaned in closer. Then start explaining. Scar's eyes drifted past me toward the mouth of the alley. There are more pieces on this board than you know. His head dropped forward before I could press him any further. Out cold. Behind me, the sedan engine roared to life. I turned just in time to see it shoot out of the alley and disappear into traffic, leaving Scar bleeding against the brick wall, and me standing there with the feeling that whatever game we'd been playing, Hawthorne might not even be the one running it. I moved quick. If Scar bled out here, I'd lose the only answer I had. I stepped back to the Indian and pulled the trauma kit from the saddlebag. The zipper sounded loud in the quiet alley. Back beside him, I pushed his coat open and looked at the wound. Upper left shoulder near the collarbone. Lucky placement. Or unlucky, depending on how you looked at it. The round had gone in high and clean. Blood was running down his arm, but it wasn't pumping the way a major artery would. I leaned closer and checked the entry point, watching the wound for a second. No bubbling, no sucking sound. Good. Didn't look like a collapsed lung. Scar groaned faintly but didn't wake up. Stay with me, I muttered, though I doubted he could hear it. I tore the trauma kit open and pulled out an X-Stat applicator. The thing looked like an oversized syringe, packed with compressed sponges meant to expand once they hit blood. Not exactly something they sold at the corner pharmacy. I pressed the applicator against the wound and drove the plunger down. The sponges deployed inside the channel and began expanding immediately, soaking up blood and filling the cavity. The bleeding slowed almost instantly. I wrapped a pressure bandage around the shoulder and cinched it tight. Scar's breathing steadied a little. I sat back on my heels and watched him for a moment. "Congratulations," I said quietly. "You're still useful." The alley stayed quiet. Too quiet, which meant the other guy was already long gone. I stood up, pulled my phone out, and dialed Ajax. When he answered, I didn't bother with greetings. "I've got Frankie Marconi bleeding in an alley behind Franklin," I said. A pause. "What happened?" Ajax asked. "Let's just say Scar tried to have a conversation with me." And now he's unconscious. Another pause. "You shoot him?" "Shoulder." "Stay there," Ajax said. "I'm on my way." The line went dead. I leaned back against the brick wall and lit one of the stale Luckies I'd found in my coat earlier. It tasted like 3-year-old regret. Across from me, Scar lay slumped against the wall, breathing slow but steady. Alive. And for the moment, the only man who knew what the hell was really going on. I was halfway through the stale Lucky when I heard it. Engines. More than one. Not the slow crawl of traffic on Franklin either. These were moving fast. I pushed myself off the brick wall and stepped toward the mouth of the alley. 2 black SUVs slid past the opening and stopped hard. Doors opened. Men stepped out. Not police. Not federal. Too clean. Too organized. Then the gray Bentley rolled up behind them like it owned the block. My stomach sank. Hawthorne. Figures. One of the men looked straight down the alley and froze. Then he raised his arm. "Back there!" So much for subtle. I flicked the Lucky away and grabbed the trauma kit off the ground. Scar was still slumped against the wall, barely conscious. Alive. But not my problem anymore. Footsteps started echoing down the alley. Fast. I moved to the Indian and kicked the engine alive. The bike roared to life just as the first of Hawthorne's men rounded the corner. One of them raised a gun. I twisted the throttle. The Indian shot forward. A round cracked past my ear and sparked off the brick beside me. I didn't slow down. The alley exit opened onto Franklin, and I burst into traffic like a missile, horns blaring as cars scattered out of my way. In the mirror, I caught a glimpse of the SUVs pulling out after me. But the Indian was smaller. Faster. I cut left through a narrow service road and shot between 2 delivery trucks before they could close the distance. A minute later, I ducked through another side street and disappeared into Riverbend traffic. By the time I slowed down 3 blocks later, the SUVs were gone. I pulled into a gas station lot and killed the engine. My heart was still pounding from the ride. Scar was back there, alive, with Hawthorne's men, which meant whatever he was about to tell me. Hawthorne was probably about to hear it too. I pulled out my phone and dialed Ajax. He answered on the second ring. "You still in the alley?" he asked. "Not anymore." "What happened?" "Hawthorne showed up before you did." A long pause. "Did he see you?" "Yeah." Another pause. "And Scar?" I stared out at the street for a second. "Hawthorne's got him now." The silence on the other end lasted a little longer this time. Finally, Ajax spoke. "Marty." "Yeah?" "You just turned this into a war." I let out a long breath before answering. "Most likely." A pause hung between us on the line. "You know the old bowling alley off Pennington and Whitmore, outside Pine Grove?" Ajax answered right away. "Yeah. Meet me there." I hung up before he could ask anything else. The Indian rumbled under me as I sat there for a moment, watching traffic roll past the gas station. Artemis's place was about the safest meeting spot in the city. At least that's what he claimed. The old bowling alley had been closed for years, windows dark, parking lot cracked and empty. The kind of place people drove past without even noticing anymore. Artemis owned it. Not directly, of course. He'd bought it through a chain of subsidiaries and holding companies that he tried explaining to me once over coffee. Something about shell corporations, asset shielding and tax advantages. I stopped listening halfway through. All I really understood was that the building belonged to him, and nobody in Riverbend seemed to realize it. He liked it that way. Artemis got a kick out of living off the grid in the middle of a neighborhood full of million-dollar houses. I kicked the Indian back into gear and pulled onto the street. If Hawthorne's men were still looking for me, Pine Grove was the last place they'd think to check. And if Artemis had already cracked open that USB drive, it was time to find out what the hell we'd really stepped into. The ride out to Pine Grove gave the engine time to cool and my nerves a chance to settle down. The old bowling alley sat exactly where it always had, wedged between two manicured neighborhoods that probably had homeowners' associations arguing about mailbox colors. From the road, it looked abandoned. The sign out front still read, "Strike King Lanes," half the letters missing. The parking lot had more cracks than pavement, but that was the front. I rode around to the back lot and rolled up to the chain-link fence. Blackout slats were woven through the metal links, cutting off the view inside. Artemis liked his privacy. I killed the engine and looked up at the building. Old brick, dark windows, dead quiet. You couldn't see the cameras. But they were there. With Artemis, they were always there. I waited. About 3 seconds later, the gate motor hummed to life. The chain-link panel rolled sideways along the track. Invitation accepted. I kicked the Indian back to life and rode through the opening. The gate slid closed behind me before I'd even made it halfway across the lot. Artemis stepped out of a side door as I cut the engine. He had a laptop tucked under one arm and a look on his face like he hadn't slept since the Clinton administration. "You look like hell," he said. "Been a busy morning." He glanced at the bike, then back at me. "Where's Ajax?" "On his way." Artemis nodded once. "Good." He turned and headed back toward the door. "You're going to want to see what's on that USB." Something in the way he said it made the back of my neck tighten. I followed him inside. Inside, the old bowling alley looked nothing like the outside promised. From the street, it was a dead building. Inside, it was another world. Rows of server racks hummed where the bowling lanes used to be. Monitors glowed across long metal work tables. Cables ran through the ceiling like vines. Cooling fans whispered steadily through the room. It felt less like a building and more like stepping onto the bridge of a starship. I'd been here before, still impressed me every time. Artemis walked ahead of me like a tour guide who had stopped caring whether the audience understood what he was talking about. "And this rack here," he said, patting a black cabinet full of blinking lights, "is isolated from the primary system, completely air-gapped. Military intrusion software can't even see it." "Good," I said, "because I barely understand the parts you're explaining now." Artemis ignored that. He was already halfway through explaining another new addition he'd installed since the last time I'd been here. "Took me 3 weeks to build the encryption stack," he continued. "Technically, it's illegal in 5 countries. "Only 5? 6, if Canada ever catches on." I was about to respond when movement outside caught my eye through the reinforced window. A familiar car rolled through the back gate, blacked out, low, heavy. The Delta 88. "Company's here," I said. Artemis glanced toward the window. The Delta pulled across the lot and came to a stop near the door. The engine cut. Ajax stepped out and stopped cold. He looked around the lot first, then at the building, then back at the lot again, like he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. We watched Ajax through the glass. "This should be fun." A second later, the door opened, and Ajax stepped inside. He stopped 3 feet into the room. His eyes slowly moved across the server racks, the monitors, the network arrays, and the cables running across the ceiling. For once in his life, the man didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at it all. Finally, he looked at me. "What?" He gestured vaguely around the entire building. The hell is this? I shrugged. Artemis's living room. Artemis gave a small, satisfied nod. Welcome to the nerve center of Riverbend. Ajax was still looking around the room like someone had dropped him into the future without warning. Server racks hummed where bowling lanes used to be. The old lane markers were still faintly visible on the floor between rows of equipment. Artemis walked past him without slowing. Shoes optional, he said. Bowling also optional. Ajax didn't laugh. He was still taking everything in. You built all of this? He asked. Artemis set the laptop down on one of the metal work tables and opened it. Some of it. He gestured around the room. Some of it builds itself once the right hardware starts talking to each other. Ajax stepped closer to one of the racks, studying the blinking lights. This is a lot. Thank you, Artemis said. Then he pointed toward a chair across the table. Sit down. We have a mutual problem to discuss. Ajax pulled the chair out slowly and sat. I leaned against the edge of the table. Artemis tapped a key, and one of the larger monitors flickered to life. Folders appeared on the screen. USB drive directories. Ajax recognized it immediately. That's the drive from Coderson. Artemis nodded. Yes. He turned the monitor slightly so both of us could see. I made a copy the moment I walked into Riverbend Police's interrogation room yesterday. Ajax raised an eyebrow. You stole evidence from a federal investigation. Artemis didn't even look up. I prefer the term secured it from incompetent custody. Ajax looked like he was about to argue. Then he sighed. Fair. Artemis clicked another folder open. Lines of code filled the screen. And now we arrive at the interesting part. I pointed at the monitor. That the tracker? Artemis smiled. Oh, yes. He leaned back in his chair. Military-grade beacon embedded in the root partition of the drive. Ajax folded his arms. That was intentional. Artemis looked at him. I assumed. He tapped the screen with a pen. You know how expensive this type of equipment is? Ajax didn't answer. Artemis answered for him. Very. Then he leaned back further. You could track a submarine with this thing. I looked at Ajax. Care to explain why you bugged a piece of evidence? Ajax met my eyes. I didn't bug evidence. He nodded toward the screen. I set bait. Artemis chuckled. Ah. He gestured toward the monitor. And our fish? Ajax shook his head. That's the problem. He looked between both of us. I knew someone would go after the drive once Coderson realized it existed. I crossed my arms. So you set the tracker? Yes. And? Ajax exhaled slowly. And it started moving. Artemis tapped a few keys. A city map appeared on the monitor. Several blinking dots lit up across Riverbend. Ajax pointed to the screen. That drive has been accessed from 3 separate networks in the last 2 weeks. I leaned forward. 3? Ajax nodded. Coderson. He pointed at the first location. Riverbend Police Department. Second location, Artemis smirked. Predictable, Ajax continued. And somewhere else. The third blinking dot sat in a part of the city I didn't immediately recognize. Artemis zoomed in. Residential blocks, quiet streets, Pine Grove area. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Ajax leaned forward in the chair. That's why I bugged the drive. He looked directly at me. I knew Hawthorne was involved. Then he looked at Artemis. But someone else keeps touching the data. The room went quiet for a moment. Finally, I spoke. You think there's another player? Ajax nodded. I know there is. He leaned back in the chair. I just don't know who. I stared at the map on the monitor. 3 locations. Coderson, Riverbend PD, and the third one blinking quietly in Pine Grove. Something about it tugged at the back of my mind. Not the map, the timing, the pieces. They didn't feel random anymore. They felt arranged. The room was quiet except for the hum of Artemis's servers. Then the moment clicked. It wasn't the code. It wasn't the tracker. It was everything around it. The aftershave. The key. The way the USB changed hands. The way it had found its way back to me. It wasn't sloppy. It was deliberate. I leaned forward slowly, resting my hands on the table. "The handoff at Coterson," I said. Neither of them interrupted. I kept going. The break-in wasn't sabotage. I looked up. It was a retrieval. Artemis smiled faintly. "Go on." I rubbed my chin, the pieces finally lining up in my head. They wanted to see if I could follow the paper trail and see where it led. Ajax's eyes narrowed slightly. And? I shook my head. I waited too long. Artemis tilted his head. "How so?" "Because I planned to use it as evidence," I said. "Against Hawthorne." That meant it stayed in my office. I pointed at the screen. "So they broke in." Ajax leaned forward. I looked back at the monitor. "And they pushed it into the system." Artemis nodded. "The 132nd. Right into Dennis Halpern's hands." I exhaled slowly. "And they sent the pictures." Ajax's voice was quiet. "The ones with Connie." I nodded once. "Pressure. Push me off the case." The room went silent again. Artemis leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. "Now that," he said, "is the Martin Keller I know." Ajax looked between the two of us. "You're saying someone engineered the entire chain?" "Yes." "And you know who?" I looked back at the blinking dot on the screen. The name had been sitting there the whole time. Right in front of me. I looked up at them. Elliot Kramer. Artemis's grin widened. Ajax didn't smile. He just leaned back in the chair and stared at the map. "Then we've got a bigger problem than Hawthorne." Chapter 9. Sinclair, January 25th, 2026. Ajax didn't say much on the drive over. That usually meant his head was working. The Delta 88 moved through Riverbend traffic like it owned the road, headlights cutting through the early evening haze. Pine Grove sat on the edge of the city where the houses got wider and the trees got older. Money lived here quietly. We pulled onto a narrow street lined with low ranch houses and manicured lawns. Ajax slowed the car. "Third house on the right," he said. I saw it. Small ranch style. Brick. Single story. Nothing about it looked like the home of a man moving millions through corporate ledgers. The driveway was empty. No Bentley, no lights. Ajax pulled the Delta to the curb and killed the engine. And the neighborhood was quiet enough that you could hear someone's sprinkler ticking 3 houses down. We stepped out. I walked halfway up the front path before I stopped. "Something's off," I said. Ajax came up beside me. The front door was closed but not fully latched. Just enough space for the porch light to spill through the crack. Ajax looked at the handle but didn't touch it. "You smell that?" he asked. I nodded. Copper. Blood. Ajax pulled a pair of latex gloves from his coat pocket and slipped them on. Then he pushed the door open carefully with the back of his knuckles. The smell got stronger. Inside the house was quiet. Too quiet. Minimal furniture. Clean lines. Books aligned perfectly on a shelf. One chair pulled slightly away from the kitchen table, and Elliot Kramer lying face down on the tile floor beside it. Dark blood had spread beneath him in a thin fan across the grout lines. Ajax stopped in the doorway. Neither of us stepped any farther inside. The body didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't do anything except lie there exactly where it had fallen. Execution style. Ajax studied the room without crossing the threshold. "No forced entry," he said quietly. I nodded. Kramer had opened the door for whoever came inside. Ajax pulled his phone from his pocket. "Bureau," he said into it. He gave the address, spoke a few short sentences, then ended the call. "CSI's coming," he said. "How long?" 10 minutes. We stayed where we were. No reason to contaminate anything. The house looked untouched. Too untouched. No broken glass, no overturned furniture. No struggle. Whoever had come through that door had done exactly what they came to do. I looked past the body toward the hallway where the office would be, the desk, the laptop, where the drive should have been. But neither of us moved, not until the scene was locked down. Ajax followed my line of sight down the hallway. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "Yeah. The drive." Ajax nodded slowly. "Probably." Outside, a car passed down the street. The normal world still moving while the one inside this house had stopped cold. 24 hours ago, Elliot Kramer had been sitting in a glass office at Coderson Holdings. Now he was lying on his kitchen floor, with half his blood soaking into tile. Ajax folded his arms and stared into the room. Someone got here before we did. I looked at the body again, too clean, too precise, too deliberate. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Looks like someone just removed our prime suspect." Ajax didn't answer right away. He kept watching the room. Finally, he spoke. "Or someone removed a loose end." The house stayed silent. A few minutes later, we heard the first SUV pull onto the street. The cavalry had arrived, and whatever answers Elliot Kramer might have had just been buried with him. Ajax stayed just outside the doorway while the Bureau turned the house into a laboratory. Black cases opened, cameras flashed. Powder dusted the air in thin gray clouds as prints were lifted from surfaces I hadn't even noticed. The quiet house filled with the low hum of professionals doing what they were trained to do. Ajax didn't move much, just stood there watching the process unfold. "Lab rats," he said to the team as they came through the door. "Full profile on the body. Sweep the house for a USB drive." One of the younger agents stepped forward from the group. Short hair, brown with blonde highlights, sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Already on it," she said. Ajax nodded toward me. "Cindy, this is Martin Keller." She gave me a quick glance, the kind that cataloged a person in half a second. "The Martin Keller?" "Depends who's asking," I said. She smirked once, then turned back to work. Cindy moved through the room like someone who had already decided she was going to run the place someday. One of the older techs dusted the kitchen table while she crouched near the body with a tablet in her hand. "Single gunshot wound," she said. "Back of the head." Ajax looked at her. "Caliber?" She leaned closer to the entry wound. "Small," she said. "Based on the channel and lack of fragmentation. Likely a .38. Execution round? Clean, controlled, professional." Cindy stood and nodded toward the kitchen table. "Coffee's still warm." Ajax glanced at it. I followed his line of sight. 2 rings on the wood surface, 1 cup sitting there, steam barely rising from it. The second ring was empty. "Meaning he had company," I said. Cindy nodded, and the company left with their cup. Ajax stepped a little closer to the doorway but still didn't cross the threshold. "No prints?" "Working on it." Another tech called from down the hallway. "Office clear." Cindy disappeared into the office for a moment. Keys tapped. Then her voice came again. "Agent Jackson, you'll want to see this." Ajax and I stayed where we were while she turned the laptop so we could see it from the doorway. Coderson Holdings financial ledgers filled the screen. Accounts, transfers, money moving through entities that didn't look like real companies. Cindy tapped another key. A secure chat window appeared. 2 user handles sat at the top. White Rose, the bean counters. Ajax leaned slightly closer. "What are we looking at?" Cindy scrolled. "Payment confirmations," she said. "References to Mackland." My stomach tightened. She scrolled again. "Also mentions exposure." The conversation looked recent. Too recent. Ajax looked back toward Kramer's body on the kitchen tile. "So he was talking when he died." "Looks that way," Cindy said. I stared at the screen. White rows, bean counters. Neither name meant anything yet. But the words did. Money. Mackland. Exposure. The three things that had been tearing this city apart for the last week. Ajax folded his arms again. "USB?" Cindy shook her head. "Gone." No hesitation. Whoever pulled the trigger hadn't come here blind. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they took it with them. Ajax looked back at the laptop screen, then at the empty coffee ring on the table. Finally, he glanced at me. "Your theory about Kramer being the mastermind," he said quietly. I shook my head. "Doesn't feel right anymore." Ajax nodded. "Yeah." He looked back at the screen. "Feels like we just lost the middleman." Outside, another FBI vehicle pulled up. Radios crackled. Doors slammed. Inside the house, the coffee on the table was still warm, and the second cup was already long gone. February was cleaning house and tying up loose ends. Elliot Kramer's pawn piece had just been removed from the board. Chapter 10. Sinclair. January 25th, 2026. The call came the next morning. Not from Artemis, not from Megan. Ajax. That alone told me it mattered. I picked up on the second ring. "Yeah. You awake?" I looked at the clock on the wall of the office. Didn't answer the question. "What happened?" A pause. Then Ajax said it flat. "Forensics came back on the body from Laura Vance's apartment." Something in my chest tightened before he even finished. "And?" "It's not Laura." The room went quiet around me. Not the peaceful kind. The kind where every other sound suddenly feels farther away than it should. I sat up a little straighter on the couch. "Say that again." "It's not Laura Vance," Ajax repeated. Dental records matched the remains to the older woman who lived 2 doors down. 3rd floor. Unit 3A. The neighbor. The one who watched doors. The one who knew too much to stay harmless. I stared at the boarded window of my office and didn't say anything for a second. Ajax let the silence sit. He was good at that. "Mrs. Delaney?" I said finally. "Yeah." My jaw tightened. I could still picture that hallway. The smell of detergent and radiator heat. The old woman behind the cracked door. The way she looked at me like she'd already decided how much to say. And now she was dead in Laura Vance's apartment. Not Laura. Her. I rubbed a hand over my face. "Where are you?" "Field office." "I'm on my way." I hung up and just sat there for a moment, looking at nothing. February was cleaning house all right. Only now the broom had a name. I got up, pulled my coat on, and headed for the door. The city looked different when a dead woman came back to life. Not brighter, not darker, just sharper. Like the lines had finally stopped blurring. By the time I reached the federal building, Ajax was waiting for me outside the security doors with a file tucked under one arm. He didn't say anything at first, just handed it over. I opened it right there on the sidewalk. Forensic summary. Dental confirmation. Age estimate. Burn trauma. Secondary blast exposure. Female, late 60s, resident of the building. Not Laura Vance, Mrs. Delaney. I looked up at him. She used the neighbor. Ajax nodded once. Looks that way. I flipped through the next page. The bomb scene put the body in Laura's apartment, I said. Enough damage to make visual ID impossible. Yeah. And by the time anybody sorted through the remains, Laura had a head start. I closed the file. Cold air moved between us while traffic rolled past on Main. She called both of us, I said. Ajax didn't respond. I kept going anyway. She called me. I looked at him. She called you. He nodded. Yes. She knew we'd come. Yes. She knew we'd come fast. Yes. The words were landing now. Heavy, deliberate. Like rounds chambering one at a time. I stared across the street at the moving traffic. The bomb wasn't meant to cover her escape. Ajax watched me closely. No? I shook my head slowly. It was meant for us. That one hung there. Neither of us tried to soften it, because there was no softer version. Laura Vance hadn't been running from the storm. She had been steering it. I let out a breath through my nose and looked back down at the file. Mrs. Delaney. Wrong place, wrong floor, or maybe just the wrong person to notice too much. Does Halpern know? I asked. Ajax nodded. He knows the body isn't Laura. And he's not thrilled. I almost laughed. Neither am I. Ajax shifted the file under his arm. There's more. Of course there was. There always is. We pulled building access, utility usage, and some phone records overnight, he said. Laura's trail doesn't stop at the apartment. I looked at him. Where does it go? He held my eyes for a second. Coderson. That didn't surprise me the way it should have. Not after Kramer. Not after the USB. Not after the way the whole thing kept folding back in on itself. She found the money trail there, I said. Ajax's expression didn't change, but I could tell I'd landed close. Maybe. No, I said. Not maybe. I looked past him at the city. At Coderson, she finds the numbers. Mackland, Hawthorne, missing money. Kramer sees what she's got. Maybe he helps her. Maybe he thinks he's controlling her. Either way, she doesn't disappear. I turned back to him. She evolves. Ajax said nothing, which in his case usually meant yes. I stepped closer. She uses Kramer to move the drive. Silence. She uses Hawthorne as the visible threat. Still nothing. And she uses me and you to make the apartment bombing look legitimate. Now Ajax spoke. You're getting ahead of the paper. I shook my head. No, the paper's just catching up. That one landed. I could see it. Because once the body stopped being Laura Vance, everything else changed shape. The fear, the calls, the timing, the bomb. None of it belonged to a cornered witness anymore. It belonged to someone planning exits. I handed the file back to him. So what now? Ajax tucked it under his arm again. Now we prove she's alive. I looked at the federal building behind him, then back at the street. Somewhere out there, Laura Vance was breathing easy under a name that probably wasn't hers, carrying information half the city would kill to bury. And the old woman down the hall had died wearing Laura's ending. I pulled my gloves on. Then we'd better move fast. Ajax nodded once, because now we weren't looking for a missing witness. We were hunting a woman who'd already survived her own murder. Artemis was already awake when we got there. That wasn't unusual. Sleep always looked optional around him. The bowling alley hummed the way it always did. Server racks whispering, monitors glowing, cooling fans pushing out air that smelled faintly of dust and electricity. Somewhere behind the old snack counter, one of his machines chirped like it had found religion. He didn't look up right away when Ajax and I came in, just kept typing. Tell me, he said, that one of you finally brought me good news. Ajax shut the door behind us. The body in Laura Vance's apartment wasn't Laura. That got him. Artemis stopped typing, slowly turned in his chair, then looked at me. "Well," he said, "that is certainly more interesting than good." I walked over to the nearest monitor. Forensics matched the remains to the older neighbor down the hall. "The hallway witness," Artemis said. "Yeah." He leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together. "So, Laura Vance fakes her death, bombs her apartment, kills the neighbor, and vanishes." Ajax folded his arms. "That's where we are." Artemis nodded once. "Excellent." I looked at him. "Excellent." He shrugged. "It means the story finally makes sense." That was Artemis. Find a ghost in the wires, and suddenly he got cheerful. He spun back to the keyboard and started moving windows around on 3 different screens. "Come here," he said. Ajax and I stepped in behind him. One screen held the Coterson ledgers. Another had the secure chat logs from Kramer's laptop. The third was full of code. Dense, ugly, layered. Artemis pointed at the code first. "This," he said, "is your second tracker." "The genius one," I said. He nodded. "The same." Ajax leaned in slightly. "Can you trace it?" Artemis gave him a look. "Agent Jackson, if I couldn't trace it, I'd have set the building on fire by now." He tapped the screen. It was embedded the same day the accounting documents were transferred onto the USB. I frowned. "The same day?" "Yes." He clicked again. Timestamp lines expanded across the monitor. "There." He pointed with a pen. "Transfer event. Coderson internal accounting files copied onto removable media." Another line. "Immediately after, secondary software package installed." I looked at Ajax. "So, the tracker wasn't added later?" "No," Artemis said before Ajax could answer. "It shipped with the documents." He turned in his chair to face us. "Which means this wasn't just surveillance." He nodded toward the code. "It was a control mechanism." "How?" I asked. Artemis smiled faintly. "Think of it like a pressure collar." I said nothing. He continued. "If the accounting files ever surfaced again, if another Macland situation started brewing, whoever controlled this software would know exactly where the leak was." Ajax's expression hardened. "A fail-safe." "Exactly," Artemis said. "Not to recover the money." He tapped the screen again. "To recover the exposure." That word sat in the room for a second. Exposure. Macland. Laura. Kramer. Everything in this case kept circling back to the same idea. Not theft, not murder, visibility. I looked at the secure chat log. "Show me that part again." Artemis swapped screens. The messages between White Rose and the bean counters filled the center monitor. Cold text on a dark screen. Payment confirmed. Macland contained. Exposure risk elevated. Transfer completed. No second incident. I stared at the words, then at the names. White Rose. The bean counters. Artemis watched me. "You see it yet?" "I think so." Ajax looked between us. "Say it." I pointed at the screen. "Bean counters isn't a company." Artemis nodded. "No. It's them." I tapped the words. "Laura and Kramer." Artemis leaned back. "The 2 accountants." Ajax looked back at the screen. "And White Rose?" That one took me a second. Not because it was hard, because once I saw it, I hated how clean it was. "Hawthorne," I said. Artemis smiled. "Go on." I looked at the secure chat again. "White Rose." I shook my head. "Not poetic." "Branding." Ajax frowned. "What are you talking about?" I pointed toward the Coderson ledgers. "Hawthorne doesn't hide like a street criminal. He hides like money." Artemis's grin widened. "Exactly." I kept going. White Rose. Clean image. Expensive image. Old money pretending it doesn't bleed. Ajax stared at the screen a moment longer, then nodded once. So, Hawthorne is White Rose. And the bean counters, I said, were Laura and Kramer. Artemis swiveled back toward the keyboard. And now we get to the part you're really going to hate. He opened another file. Wire paths, account trees, shell entities stepping down through nested LLCs and quiet holding firms like a staircase built by cowards. He pointed to a cluster. This is the embezzlement path. Ajax leaned in. Walk me through it. Artemis did what he did best. He made something impossibly complicated sound, insulting in its simplicity. Coderson holds the books. Harborfront moves the freight. Hawthorne signs the top paper. Mackland notices the irregularity and tries to leverage it. He tapped one branch. Laura finds the same discrepancy while auditing. Another tap. Kramer realizes the discrepancy can be weaponized. Another. So the two accountants begin carving value out of the gap. I watch the money move across the screen, layer after layer. Not stealing from Coderson, I said. Artemis nodded. No. Stealing from Hawthorne. That earned me a sideways glance from Ajax. Artemis smiled wider. Now you're awake. I stared at the account tree. Laura and Kramer weren't just covering up numbers. They were bleeding Hawthorne carefully, small enough not to trigger panic, large enough to matter. And Mackland? I asked. Artemis clicked open a side ledger. There. A transfer line lit up. Mackland doesn't create the fraud. He discovers it. Ajax folded his arms tighter and tries to blackmail Hawthorne. Exactly, Artemis said. He sees the same weakness Laura sees. I looked at the secure chat again. Mackland contained. No second incident. The words hit different now. Second incident, I said quietly. Artemis nodded. As in, don't let another Mackland happen. Ajax looked at the code again. So the second tracker was built to make sure the accounting documents never got loose twice. Yes, Artemis said. Once Mackland became a problem, White Rose learned. I exhaled slowly. Hawthorne installed a leash on his own corruption. Better, Artemis said. He paid someone else to build one. I looked at him. You can prove that. Artemis clicked twice more and pulled up a development log buried in the software package. A payment authorization tag. Internal approval string. White Rose-PRV. Below it, a linked compensation record routed through a shell vendor. Bean Counter Solutions. I stared at the screen. There it was. Not the whole confession, but enough. Enough to show Hawthorne commissioned the tracker. Enough to show Laura and Kramer had access to it. Enough to show everybody in this case had been using everybody else. Ajax straightened. This gives me Hawthorne on concealment, corruption, and instrumented surveillance. Artemis nodded. It gives you more than that. He pointed to the chat log. Payment, Mackland, exposure. Then to the software, intent. Then to the transfer tree. And motive. I looked at the glowing screens and felt the shape of the whole thing settle into place. Laura hadn't stumbled into a scandal. She'd walked into an open vault. Kramer helped her carry the bags. Hawthorne built the alarm system. Mackland tripped it first. And now everybody was dead or disappearing. Except her. I looked at Ajax. So where does that leave us? Ajax stared at the White Rose messages a long second before answering. With enough to hang Hawthorne. Then he looked at me. But not enough to catch Laura. Artemis didn't turn from the monitors. Not yet. The room went quiet except for the hum of machines and the slow electronic pulse of data moving through places built to hide it. I stared at Laura's name inside the audit trail, not as a victim, not as a witness, as a participant, as one half of the bean counters. And finally, for the first time since the bombing, the truth stopped looking scattered. It looked organized, deliberate, profitable. I let out a slow breath. Then we stopped chasing the ghost. Ajax glanced over. And start? I looked back at the screens. Start following the money she kept. Artemis was still moving windows around when Ajax stepped away to make the call. He didn't go far, just far enough to keep federal procedure sounding official instead of desperate. I watched him through the glass partition at the edge of the old pro shop while he spoke into the phone in that low, steady voice of his. No wasted words, no drama, just facts getting sharpened into charges. Behind me, Artemis made a quiet sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite concern. I turned back toward the monitors. What? He didn't answer right away. That usually meant he'd found something he wanted to enjoy for a second before sharing it. Then he tapped the screen. Your ghost, he said. What about her? Artemis enlarged one of the account trees. More shell companies bloomed across the monitor like a disease map. Bean Counter Solutions, Rosewater Advisory, 3 export fronts, 2 consulting firms that looked too clean to be real. And there, buried in the middle of it, one line item pulsing yellow. I leaned closer. What am I looking at? Artemis pointed with the pen. 3 staged withdrawals over 6 days. From Hawthorne? From one of Hawthorne's protected accounts, he said. Protected in the sense that only criminals and tax attorneys would call it protected. I stared at the transfer chain. The money didn't move straight. Of course it didn't. It stepped sideways. Small cuts. 40,000 here, 80 there. 120 routed through harborfront-related freight insurance. Then something bigger. My eyes narrowed. That one, I said. Artemis nodded. 750,000. I looked at him. That's not siphoning. No, he said. That's confidence. He clicked again. The account trail widened. 3 more transfers unfolded beneath it. Different dates, different shells, same destination cluster, different direction, same hand. I started doing the math in my head. Artemis did it for me. She's already pulled 1.3. I looked back at the screen. Million. He gave me a patient stare. No, Marty. Bowling points. I ignored that. 1.3 million. Confirmed. I leaned both hands on the table. The room seemed quieter all of a sudden. Not because the machines had stopped humming. Because now the numbers had weight. Laura wasn't running with paperwork. She was running with cash. A lot of it. I looked at the transfer strings again. She started moving it before the bombing. Artemis nodded. Yes. So, by the time we hit the apartment, she was already exiting. The words landed hard. I looked at Laura's name sitting in the audit log. She hadn't improvised this. She'd built it, layer by layer. Quietly enough that Macklin saw it. Quietly enough that Hawthorne panicked. Quietly enough that Kramer thought he could write it. And now, Kramer was dead on his kitchen floor. I let out a breath through my nose. How much can she still reach? Artemis clicked through another file. Depends how quickly she can access the remaining shells before the Bureau starts freezing connected accounts. And if she moves fast? He gave me a look. She's been moving fast. I looked over at Ajax, still on the phone, still building the case. Can we stop it? Artemis tilted his head side to side. Maybe. I hated that answer. Try something else. He sighed and clicked deeper into the ledger tree. There's another tranche pending. My eyes went back to the screen. A scheduled movement. Timed. Layered. Waiting. How much? Artemis zoomed in. 600,000. And after that? He opened one more branch. The number sat there like a punch to the throat. I said it before he did. 9. He nodded. 900,000. I straightened up. 1.3 already gone. Correct. 600 pending. Yes. 9 after that. Yes. I looked at him. That gets her to 2.8. Artemis shrugged, assuming every transfer clears. I stared at the numbers a second longer. Then it clicked. No. Artemis looked at me. No what? She won't take it all. That got his attention. I pointed at the screen. She's too careful. I traced the route with my finger just above the glass. She knows once Hawthorne gets hit publicly, every account tied to him starts locking up. She won't chase everything. Artemis's eyes narrowed slightly. She'll take what she can carry clean. I nodded. Enough to disappear. Not enough to make the whole world chase one number. Artemis leaned back in his chair. That, he said, is annoyingly smart. I looked back at the pending transfer. 2.5. He blinked once, then his grin spread slowly. Yes, I pointed again. She already has 1.3. She'll take the 6. Yes. And most of the 9 if she can trim it before the freeze. Artemis nodded. 2.5 is the escape number. Not greed, not total victory. Just enough. Enough to vanish well. Enough to start over somewhere that didn't ask questions. Enough to live like Laura Vance had never existed. Ajax came back into the room then, phone already in his pocket. His face told me the call had gone the way he wanted. I've got the warrant request moving, he said. For Hawthorne? He nodded once. Financial conspiracy, concealment, surveillance misuse, obstruction, and enough connective tissue on Mackland to put him in front of a judge. Artemis nodded toward the monitors. Good timing. Ajax stepped closer. What now? I pointed at the account tree. Laura's already been draining him. Ajax looked at the screen. How much? 1.3 confirmed, Artemis said. Additional transfers queued. Ajax's expression hardened. Can we intercept? Artemis spread his hands. I can flag, map, predict, and scream at the screen. That a no? That's a depends on how fast your bureaucracy runs. Ajax looked at the pending transfers. How much does she end up with if we miss? I answered before Artemis could. 2.5. Ajax turned toward me. You sure? I nodded. She won't empty him. Why not? Because emptying him makes noise, I said. 2.5 makes distance. Artemis gave a slow, approving nod. She takes enough to disappear. Leaves enough behind to slow the response and muddy motive. Ajax stared at the screen another second. Then he looked at both of us. So Hawthorne gets the warrant. And Laura gets the chase, I said. That settled over the room in silence. For the first time since the apartment blast, the case had split clean in two. Hawthorne was the public fire. Laura was the exit wound. Artemis started typing again. Fast. Purposeful. He opened a new map and began linking transit nodes, shell activity, burner phone pings, and residual access attempts across the metro area. What are you doing? Ajax asked. Building your ghost a roadmap. Ajax folded his arms. You think she's still local? Artemis didn't look up. She was local when Kramer died. She was local when the second transfer cleared. And unless she's developed teleportation overnight, she's still local now. I looked at the map blooming across the screen. Airport access, rail lines, harbor routes, cash withdrawal buffers, safe properties, Pine Grove, downtown, 2 suburban dead drops. 1 storage unit tied through a vendor account that should have been empty. Laura's shadow was all over the city now that we knew what shape to look for. Ajax pulled his phone back out. I'm pushing the Hawthorne warrant now. He looked at me. Once that lands, he won't be our problem anymore. I shook my head. He'll still be a problem. Ajax gave a dry half-smile. Just not tonight. I looked back at the transfer chain on the screen. 1.3 gone. 600 ready. 900 waiting in the dark. Laura Vance had been ahead of us the whole time. Not by luck, by design. I slipped my gloves back on and reached for the coat draped over the chair. Ajax noticed. Where are you going? I looked at the map. At the moment? Artemis finally stopped typing and looked up. Please say somewhere illegal. I ignored that. We stopped waiting for her to make the next move. Ajax's eyes stayed on me. And start? I looked at the glowing transfer path one last time. Start chasing the woman who already won. By the time Ajax and I got there, Laura Vance was already gone. The place was a short-term rental tucked behind a row of expensive townhomes near the river. Anonymous enough to disappear into. Clean enough to avoid attention. The kind of place people use when they don't plan on staying long enough to leave a memory. Artemis had walked us to it through the money. 1 last transfer attempt. 1 failed login. A delivery receipt tied to a burner name and a prepaid card. Enough to get us to the door. Not enough to get us there in time. Ajax reached it first. Gloves on, weapon low. He pressed himself beside the frame and listened. Nothing. No movement. No television. No footsteps. No breath. He looked at me once, then pushed the door open. The place was dark except for a lamp burning in the far room. We entered slow. Living room first. Small couch. Open suitcase on the floor. Closet empty. Kitchen counters wiped clean. No dishes in the sink. No trash left behind. That told me more than anything else. Laura hadn't run. She had departed. Ajax moved toward the bedroom. I followed a few steps behind him. The bed was stripped. Drawers open. Bathroom mirror clean enough to suggest she'd wiped that too. Not panic. Procedure. I turned back toward the small dining table near the window. That's where I saw it. The USB drive, sitting dead center on the table under the glow of the lamp, like it had been placed there with a ruler. Not dropped, not forgotten. Displayed. I stopped walking. Ajax followed my eyes. Well, he said quietly. I stepped closer but didn't touch it. Not yet. The same black plastic. Same cheap casing. Same little piece of poison we'd all been bleeding over for days. Only now it looked smaller than I remembered. Smaller and meaner. There was nothing else on the table. No note, no message. Didn't need one. The message was the drive. I looked around the room again. No papers, no cash, no second bag. No phone. Nothing personal. She'd taken the money, taken the trail, taken the future, and left us the evidence. Ajax circled once through the apartment, checking corners and windows. She's gone. Yeah. He came back into the room and stood across from me with the table between us. How long? I looked at the lamp, still warm, then at the empty coffee mug beside the sink. Dry, not recent. Long enough, I said. Ajax nodded once. Not arguing. I stared at the USB. She wanted us to find it. Yes. She wanted us to know she was done with it. Yes. I let out a slow breath. The whole case had lived inside that piece of plastic for so long, it was easy to forget what it really was. A ledger, a key, a leash, a weapon. But never the prize. The prize had always been the money. And Laura Vance had understood that before any of us did. I finally reached into my coat, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and picked the drive up between 2 fingers. It felt almost weightless, like it hadn't ruined enough lives to deserve gravity. Ajax watched me turn it over once in my hand. She left it as a symbol, I said. A symbol of what? I looked at the lamplit table, the emptied room, the careful silence she'd left behind. Victory. Ajax didn't answer that. Didn't need to. Because standing there in that clean little room, it was hard to call it anything else. We had Hawthorne. Sooner or later the courts would have him too. The warrants were moving. The trial machine was already warming up. But Laura had taken $2.5 million of Rupert Hawthorne's money and slipped out through the seam before the room even realized it had a door. I slid the USB into an evidence bag from my pocket and handed it off to Ajax. He sealed it without a word. Then he looked around the apartment one last time. She beat him. I shook my head. She beat all of us. That one stayed in the room a second. Then Ajax glanced toward the dark window. She won't stay gone forever. I looked at the empty suitcase on the floor, the wiped counters, the stripped bed, the lamp left on like a curtain call. Maybe, I said, but she'll stay gone long enough. Ajax took that in. Then he nodded toward the door. Come on. I didn't move right away. I stood there another second, looking at the place where Laura Vance had chosen to leave the drive behind. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. A final little lesson from the woman who'd built the board and walked off with the winnings. You can keep the proof. I kept the prize. I turned off the lamp and followed Ajax out. By the time we hit the street, the river wind had picked up. Cold, sharp, clean enough to make you think the city didn't know what had just happened. But it did. Riverbend always knows. It just doesn't care until the headlines catch up. And somewhere out there, under another name and carrying Rupert Hawthorne's money, Laura Vance was already becoming someone else. Chapter 11. Sinclair, January 25th, 2026. March showed up the way it always does in Riverbend, without apology, without warmth, just a different kind of cold. The sky over the courthouse had gone pale and hard by the time I got there, the kind of gray that makes marble buildings look cleaner than the men walking into them. Satellite vans lined the curb. Reporters stood in neat coats and practiced expressions, all of them pretending they cared about justice, when what they really cared about was a good angle and a name spelled right on the evening crawl. Rupert Hawthorne had both. I stood across the street with my collar up and my hands in my coat pockets, watching the crowd tighten near the front steps. Murder trials have a gravity to them, even before they start, especially when the man walking in used to own half the skyline. Hawthorne stepped out of the transport van in a gray suit and restraints. He still looked expensive. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that he looked smaller than he used to. Not weak, not broken. Just reduced. Like the world had finally started charging him interest. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions he had no intention of answering. Did you order William Macklin's murder? Did you know Laura Vance was alive? Did Coderson Holdings move funds through Harborfront? Hawthorne didn't look left or right, just climbed the courthouse steps between two marshals like a man headed into weather he could no longer buy off. I watched him disappear through the doors and felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not closure. Just the quiet recognition that one part of the board had finally been boxed up. Behind me, the city kept moving. Traffic hissed over wet pavement. A bus groaned to a stop. Somebody laughed too loudly near the coffee cart on the corner. March had begun, and Riverbend was already pretending February never happened. Thought I'd find you here. I turned. Artemis stood a few feet away in a dark overcoat that probably cost too much and fit him like the tailor had given up halfway through. He had a paper cup in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. You look cheerful, I said. I'm a defense attorney, he replied. Misery reads as unprofessional. He stepped beside me and looked up at the courthouse. "That's a nice visual," he said. "Hawthorne in cuffs. If I were cruel, I'd frame it." "You are cruel." "Yes," Artemis said, "but selectively." I nodded toward the envelope. "What's that?" He handed it over. I didn't have to open it to know. Board of Licensure, official seal, thin paper. Bad news always travels light. I opened it anyway. The words were exactly as cold as I expected them to be. Professional misconduct, conflict of interest, compromised investigative integrity, 30-day suspension of private investigator license, effective immediately. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Artemis sipped his coffee beside me. "Well, 30 days. He nodded. "That's actually better than I expected." I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "Funny," I said. "That's exactly the part I don't find comforting." Artemis looked over at me. "You got too close to a client tied to an active matter. There were photographs, a documented timeline, and, if we're being honest, very poor judgment." "I'm aware." "Good. Self-awareness saves me billable hours." I watched another knot of reporters push closer to the courthouse steps. Connie Macklin's name hadn't been spoken out loud this morning, but it didn't need to be. It sat in the background of the whole thing like a bruise under a shirt collar. Not visible from a distance, still there. Artemis shifted beside me. "For what it's worth, the board didn't revoke." "No, they could have." "Yeah." He let that sit for a second. 30 days means they believe you were compromised. I kept watching the courthouse doors. But not corrupt. That landed somewhere deeper than I wanted it to, because there's a difference. One ruins your career, the other ruins your name. And in Riverbend, your name usually goes first. I looked down at the envelope again. 30 days. 30 mornings without the office door unlocking under my hand. 30 days without a license, a retainer, or the lie that I was still operating inside the lines. March had started by taking the sign off my door without bothering to remove the glass. "Ajax here?" I asked. Artemis nodded toward the courthouse. "Inside. Testimony logistics. Chain of evidence. Federal posturing." "Sounds like him." "He asked me to tell you something." I waited. Artemis took another sip of coffee. "He said Laura Vance is still gone." I laughed once, no humor in it. "Good update." He also said the last confirmed number is 2.5. That pulled my eyes away from the courthouse. Exactly. Close enough for prosecutors and accountants. $2.5 million. Not all of Hawthorne's money. Just the part she needed. The part she could carry clean. Enough to disappear. Enough to make the rest of the case look like smoke and paperwork while she moved through some airport under a different name and a better coat. I looked back toward the steps. Hawthorne on trial, Laura in the wind, Kramer dead, Macklin buried, and me standing on a sidewalk with 30 days of enforced reflection folded in an envelope under my arm. That was February's final joke. The city got its public villain. Laura got the cash. I got the lesson. The courthouse doors opened again, and another wave of people moved inside. Reporters adjusted their notes. Cameramen shifted shoulders. Somewhere in the crowd, somebody said Hawthorne's name like it was still worth money. Maybe it was. For the lawyers. For the papers. For the people selling outrage by the hour. Artemis glanced at me. "You going in?" I shook my head. "No." He nodded once. "Probably wise. Judges like symmetry. Suspended investigators in the gallery tend to upset the furniture." I let that pass. The wind coming off the avenue cut between the buildings and found the opening in my collar. March, cold. Sharper than February. Less dramatic, more honest. I reached into my coat pocket and found the old pack of Luckies I'd been carrying around like a superstition. 3 years stale, still too bent to smoke. I turned the pack over in my hand and looked at the courthouse one last time. February had put Rupert Hawthorne on trial. That part was easy. The harder part was everything it put on me. 30 days. Connie Mackland, a dead accountant on a kitchen floor. An old woman burned in another woman's apartment. And Laura Vance walking away with $2.5 million and the good sense to leave the USB behind like a signature. You can keep the evidence. I kept the win. I slipped the cigarettes back into my pocket. Artemis looked at me. What now? I stared at the courthouse doors as Rupert Hawthorne's trial began behind them. Then at the traffic. Then at the low gray sky hanging over Riverbend like an unpaid bill. Now, I said, I wait 30 days. Artemis grimaced. That sounds terrible. It is. He tucked his chin against the wind. You'll survive. Yeah. He looked at me sideways. You usually do. He headed toward his car after that, leaving me on the sidewalk with the courthouse at my back and March in my lungs. I stayed there a little longer. Long enough to watch the headlines form in other people's mouths. Long enough to understand that justice had happened here. Just not the clean kind. The city got its trial. Laura got her escape. And me. I got 30 days to think about how a man can be right about everything important and still lose on the details. That's the part nobody tells you when you get your license. Not in the classes, not in the code book, not in the board letters. Truth doesn't always save your standing. Sometimes it just costs you slower. I turned up my collar and started walking. March had begun, and Riverbend, as usual, had already moved on.